Mexico Territory, August 1880. A seamstress stands in a smoke-filled hallway. In small woman dark dress, a gun in her hand that everyone in this town swore was broken. 3 men stare at her from the top of the stairs. Nobody moves. The hammer clicks back. One sound. Clean. Final. Like a door closing on everything that came before. Somewhere below, her daughter is waiting in the dark, somewhere in Denver. A colonel who murdered her father 12 years ago is boarding a train heading south. And somewhere on the wall of a burned-out dress shop, 2 empty iron pegs where a dead man's gun used to hang. The first man reaches for his pistol. She fires. What'll you do with a broken gun? Turns out, everything. The snow came sideways that evening, driving itself against the hospital windows in sheets that turned the city lights outside into watercolor smears of amber and white. The hallway beyond room 14 smelled of carbolic soap and something older underneath. Something belonging to rooms where people arrived to finish their business with the world. Clara Sinclair was 26 years old and had not cried yet. She kept counting this as a small private victory. She had ridden the trolley across Denver with her coat buttoned wrong, noticed it halfway across the city, and decided it didn't matter. She had signed the visitor's log with her left hand by accident. She had sat in the wooden chair beside her grandmother's bed for going on 3 hours now, and she had not cried. Not once. What she had done was read the newspaper. 4 times, the headline sat in her lap where she'd folded the paper open to page 4, the page she'd found by accident while searching for the weather report and found something considerably more disorienting instead. The widow of Stone Creek, 118 outlaw, 1 broken gun, beneath it a photograph. Grainy, the way photographs from 40 years ago were grainy, as though the world itself hadn't quite decided to come into focus yet. A woman standing in front of a storefront, small, 5'2" on a generous day. Dark dress, neat collar, hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for anything decorative. A gun on her hip that even in a faded photograph managed to look like it meant something. Clara had looked at that photograph, then at her grandmother in the hospital bed, then at the photograph again. Same jaw. Same way of holding the shoulders, straight but not rigid, like someone who had decided long ago that the world would have to work for it if it wanted to knock her down. Same eyes, even though the photograph was black and white and her grandmother's eyes were currently closed. The lids thin and bluish in the way that made Clara's chest do something complicated she refused to name. On the bedside table, between a glass of water nobody had touched and a small tin of throat lozenges the night nurse had left, sat the gun from the photograph, real present. Considerably more battered than it appeared in print. The brass frame had gone the color of old pennies left in a drawer. The walnut grip was worn smooth in a way that spoke of decades of handling, the grain barely visible anymore beneath the oils of countless palms. And the hammer. The hammer was stuff clean at the base, the break old and darkened, clearly not recent, clearly not accidental. Clara had been staring at that broken hammer for better than an hour trying to make it make sense. 118 outlaws. 1 broken gun. She was a schoolteacher. She taught arithmetic to 9-year-olds in Santa Fe and understood that these 2 facts could not coexist without an explanation connecting them, and the explanation was currently unconscious in a hospital bed with pneumonia working its way through her lungs like a slow and deliberate tenant who had decided not to leave. The woman in the bed stirred, not dramatically, just a small shift. A drawn breath, the movement of a body still negotiating its options. Then the eyes opened. Gray-green, the color of sage after rain, sharp in a way that had no business being sharp at this particular moment given everything pressing down on the room. Her grandmother's gaze moved to the newspaper in Clara's lap, then to Clara's face, then back to the newspaper. Something crossed that face that was neither amusement nor irritation but managed somehow to be both at once. Found it, did you? Not a question. The voice was rougher than usual, scraped raw by illness and weeks of difficult breathing, but the inflection was pure Eliza Ward. Declarative where everyone else would have been apologetic. Page 4. Clara heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. Between an advertisement for tonic water and the weather forecast, cold front coming in from the north. Grandmother, I read it this morning, before my lungs decided to stage their little protest. 118. Clara picked up the newspaper and held it up, not accusatory, just present. The way you hold up evidence you genuinely need explained. The paper says 118 outlaws. It says this gun. She reached out and touched the barrel of the Colt with 2 fingers gently. The way you touch something you're not certain is safe. It says this specific gun. The one with the broken hammer, a pause. The hammer is broken, I'm aware. A gun with a broken hammer cannot fire. Correct. So how? Sit down, Clara. The eyes closed briefly, then opened again. Not tired. Something else. The look of a decision being made in real time. The look of a woman choosing which truth to begin with. It starts with a lie I told my daughter for 30 years. And before you make that face, understand that some lies are the kindest thing a person can offer. I spent considerable time learning the difference between a lie that protects and one that poisons, and I made the right call each time. You can argue with me about it after I'm gone. I'll be in no position to defend myself, which will make it more satisfying for you. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. The snow hit the window with a sound like scattered sand. Sit down, her grandmother said again, quieter this time. The quietness of someone who is not repeating a request, but delivering a gift. It's a long story. It starts in a town called Stone Creek, New Mexico Territory. In the summer of 1880, it starts with a needle and a bolt of ivory silk and a little girl playing on the floor. And it starts with a gun on the wall that everyone in that town thought was useless. Clara sat down. She looked at her grandmother, 77 years old, which meant she had been 33 in 1880, which meant the woman in the photograph and the woman in this bed were the same distance from that summer as Clara was from her own birth, and somehow that arithmetic made it more real rather than less. Folded the newspaper, set it aside. Outside, Denver dissolved into white, and 1880 began. The heat that summer had opinions. It settled into town around 9 each morning and stayed well past dark, pressing down on rooftops and driving horses to stand motionless in whatever shade existed, making even the most energetic residents move through their days with a negotiated slowness that everyone agreed was sensible and nobody admitted was surrender. The needle moved through ivory silk with precision, unhurried. Eliza Jane Stoneward had sewn 3 wedding dresses that summer alone. 3 young women with the particular brightness behind their eyes that comes from believing the future is a room you simply haven't walked into yet. That every arrangement of satin and lace pressed into careful pleats is a promise the world intends to keep. She had dressed them all, fitted the bodices, let out seams where needed, pressed the lace with an iron heated to the exact temperature that removed wrinkles without scorching. She had believed those same things once. May sat cross-legged on the workroom floor, turning her wooden doll over in her small hands with the focused attention that 5-year-olds bring to everything they consider genuinely important. The doll was rough-carved but recognizable, a figure with a painted smile that had mostly worn away to a kind of pleasant blankness. Her father had made it 2 winters before he died, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with a jackknife and a block of pine, working by lamplight while Eliza read, and May watched from her chair with the absolute certainty that her father's hands could produce anything they set themselves to. He had been right about most things. Wrong about one, in the end. He had believed that being careful and honest and hard-working was enough, that a man who did his work well and treated his neighbors square would be left alone to live in peace. Eliza had believed it alongside him. She set the needle down and let her eyes rest on the workroom wall. The Colt 1851 Navy hung on 2 iron pegs at eye level, positioned with a deliberateness that suggested it had been placed rather than stored, mounted like something that deserved acknowledgement even in its current condition. The brass frame had long since gone from gold to the color of old tea. The walnut grip bore the wear of years of handling, a slight hollowing where a thumb had rested thousands of times. The gun itself was otherwise maintained, clean and oiled and recognizable to anyone familiar with the previous decades as exactly what it had been, a serious piece of machinery made by people who understood their craft. The hammer was snapped off at the base. The break was old, darkened with time, and had been made cleanly and deliberately by someone who knew what they were doing and had reasons for doing it that Eliza understood better than anyone alive. Everyone in Stone Creek knew whose gun it had been. Not everyone asked why the hammer was broken. The ones who did got a short answer. It doesn't work anymore. Which was true, which was the only part of the truth they needed. May's voice floated up from the floor without urgency, the tone of a child raising a subject that had been waiting patiently. Mama, Tell me about Grandpa Flint. Eliza picked up the needle again, drew thread through fabric. What would you like to know, little bird? Was he really the fastest gun in the whole territory? The afternoon light through the shop window had gone golden and slanted, catching the dust drifting above May's head. 48 men. That was the number people quoted when they spoke about Hank Stone. Though Eliza had never verified it and suspected the accounting was more complicated and less tidy than the legend suggested. 48 men who had decided to draw first. Every single one of them wrong about how that would end. He was fast, she said carefully. But more than that, he was smart. He knew when to draw and when to walk away. He understood that the second skill was harder to learn than the first. Did he teach you to shoot? The memory came without invitation. 12 years old, standing in the canyon behind their old cabin outside Stone Creek, the summer heat pressing equally on both their shoulders, her father's hand settling onto her arms to position her stance. Gentle and certain at once, the way all his movements were. That quality of deliberate care she had grown up thinking was simply how adults moved through the world and only later recognized as something particular to him. Please, Pa, teach me. I want to be like you. Hank Stone had crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. He was a large man who moved as though he weighed nothing, and that discrepancy had always seemed significant to her, like something beneath the surface of his self-management that cost more than he allowed to show. His voice had been gentle and absolute in the same breath, both things at once. The way his voice was whenever something mattered enough to say carefully, "This life ends with me, Eliza. You deserve better than counting bodies and running from the past. You're going to live peaceful. You're going to be something I could never manage to be." What's that, Pa? Happy? He had never taught her, not one lesson. She had watched him move through the world with that permanent low-level awareness, the way his eyes inventoried rooms before his feet crossed the threshold, the way he always positioned himself with a wall at his back and a clear line to the nearest exit. She had absorbed those habits without intending to, the way you absorb the rhythms of the house you grew up in, and had only noticed she'd done it years later, when Thomas had asked her why she always faced the door in restaurants, and she hadn't been able to give him an answer that didn't sound like something her father would have said. "No," she told May, "he never taught me to shoot." The shop bell above the door rang. Her hand moved to the scissors on the cutting table before her mind had fully processed the sound. Old reflex, not panic. The automatic repositioning of a person who had grown up in a house where awareness was considered good manners rather than paranoia. The man who came through the door was someone she needed to know quickly, which was a distinction her father had taught her to make before she understood why it mattered. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested it was structural rather than built, the kind of size that comes from genetics rather than labor. His coat was black wool, an unusual choice for August in New Mexico, and he wore it buttoned, which was unusual further still. His hat brim was angled down enough to require a conscious lift of the chin to make eye contact, which he did immediately, looking at her with the directness of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival. The smile was wide, too wide for a first impression, too certain. The kind of smile that was not an expression of pleasure but an instrument of something else entirely. Mrs. Ward. His voice moved through the room the way expensive furniture occupies space, as though it belonged there, and everything else was a visitor. "I own the WWII ranch north of town. Royce Marshall. Perhaps you've heard of me." She had heard of him. Everyone in Stone Creek had heard of Royce Marshall. Not because he had done anything specifically dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that is the thing," but because he occupied the territory the way a weather system does, as a fact of the landscape that smaller operations learn to plan around. Cattle, land. A particular way of conducting business that resulted in smaller ranches consistently becoming absorbed into larger ones. The transitions accomplished through what everyone understood to be pressure, and what nobody could prove was anything other than reasonable commerce. "Mr. Marshall." She set the needle down without making a production of it. "I don't believe we have business." "Oh, but we might." He stepped inside, his boots on the workroom floor, making the boards register his weight with a heaviness that seemed intentional. He looked around the room with the mild interest of a man conducting an appraisal. "I heard you sold your late husband's ranch to the Harmon family. Fine people, the Harmons. Hardworking, The last word landed flat in a way that made it mean its opposite. The Harmons paid fairly. Not as fairly as I would have. He moved to examine a bolt of blue fabric on the cutting table, touching the edge briefly before letting it fall. I had offered to buy that land before you sold it, Mrs. Ward. Good grazing territory. Water access that doesn't dry up in August. I would have paid very generously, a pause that arranged itself with care. I'm a generous man when I want something, and I'm not a man who enjoys being refused. May had gone quiet on the floor. Children always sensed these shifts before adults could name them, some animal accuracy in their reading of the air inside a room. She had drawn her knees up and was holding her doll against her chest in a way that was less play and more something instinctive. Eliza stood. Moved without hurrying, but deliberately, positioning herself between Marshall and her daughter, with the cutting table at her back and the full width of the workroom between May and this man with his August coat and his too wide smile. She was 5'2", he was well over 6. The arithmetic was not in her favor. She did it anyway because her father had also taught her this. How to stand, how to look at a dangerous man directly and not let the looking become flinching. The land is sold, Mr. Marshall. I'm sorry you're disappointed. His gaze moved past her shoulder to the wall, to the colt on its iron pegs. Something in his expression sharpened at the edges. That's Flint Stone's gun, isn't it? Not a question. I'd recognize that piece anywhere. Heard it was your father's. He looked back at her. Heard he was the best. Fastest draw in 3 territories. His eyes returned to the wall. Also heard that hammer's been broken for near a decade. A weighted pause. Shame. A gun like that should work. Should be ready. His gaze came back to hers and held. You never know when trouble might come calling. The threat was naked. It wore no disguise because it didn't need one. It sat in the August warmth of her workroom among bolts of fabric and half-finished seams and did not trouble itself to apologize for its presence. Get out of my shop, of course, Mrs. Ward. He turned toward the door with the ease of a man for whom hurry was always optional. At the door he paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at May. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. At a 5-year-old girl with her mother's coloring and her grandfather's eyes, holding a wooden doll against her chest on a workroom floor. Beautiful daughter you have. Reminds me how fragile things are. How quickly accidents can happen in ranching country. The shop bell rang behind him, cheerful and entirely out of register with what had just occurred in the room it announced. Eliza stood in the middle of her workroom with the August heat pressing down and her hands clasped together in front of her so May couldn't see them shaking. Mama, May's voice came out very small. Who was that man? Nobody important, little bird. She heard the steadiness in her own voice and understood what it had cost to produce it. Nobody at all. That night, after May had fallen asleep in the small room behind the shop, after Eliza had sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes doing nothing in particular, after she had stood up and poured water and sat back down and poured the water out and stood up again, she pulled the wooden box from beneath her bed, Thomas's things. She had packed it 3 months after the funeral, when grief had settled from sharp into something more like structural damage, the kind you learn to build your daily life around rather than through. His pocket watch, his wedding ring. A photograph from their wedding day, both of them young and unsuspecting in the particular way of people who haven't yet been introduced to what the world is capable of arranging. Letters from his mother back east. A small spool of fence wire he'd been saving for a project she had never learned the details of. And at the very bottom, beneath everything else, hidden in a false bottom she had not known existed until her fingers found the seam tonight. A leather journal. Small, water-stained at the corners. His handwriting on the first page. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal unopened for several minutes. The lamplight was steady. The sounds of Stone Creek at night came through the window. Horses and wind, and somewhere the distant tinny piano from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary night in August. Except for the journal in her hands and Royce Marshall's voice still sitting in her memory like a stone she couldn't dislodge. She opened it, Thomas's handwriting, which was normally precise and confident, the penmanship of a man who had attended school longer than most, and was quietly proud of it, had gone irregular toward the end, tilted, pressed harder into the paper. The writing of a man who had been composing with urgency rather than care. July 15, 1879, Marshall came to the ranch again, 3rd time this month, wants the whole eastern section. Offering twice what it's worth. Why? What does he know about this land that I don't? August 3, 1879. Found survey markers on the eastern boundary near the creek junction. Someone has been testing the soil and water composition. Not recently. This has been going on for months at least. It has to be Marshall. If there's silver under this land, I will not sell. This is May's inheritance. This is what we built for her. November 28, 1879. Saw Marshall in town today with a man I didn't recognize. Older, maybe 60. Military bearing. The kind that stays in the shoulders even after the uniform is long gone. Expensive clothes. Eastern money, not Western. They were arguing outside Grayson's assayer office, and when they saw me watching, they stopped. Just stopped, mid-sentence, and looked at me. The older man looked at me with an expression I cannot adequately describe except to say that it reminded me of the way a man looks at something he has already decided to get rid of. December 10, 1879. I need to talk to Buck Harlan. Something is wrong here. That man with Marshall. I've been asking around carefully. People say he's some kind of colonel out of Denver. Brandt, someone told me. Colonel Silas Brandt, retired cavalry. Why does that name mean something to me? I think Eliza's father mentioned a Brandt once, years ago. Said to stay away. Said he was the kind of poison that doesn't have a smell. December 11, 1879. Tomorrow I ride to town to find Buck Harlan. He'll know what to do. He always knows what to do. If anything happens to me, the entry stopped there. The pen had simply ceased moving, as though the writer had been interrupted, or had thought better of completing the sentence, or had decided that writing the rest of it would make something too real that needed to stay unreal a little longer. Thomas Ward had died on December 12, 1879. Found at the bottom of the canyon east of the ranch where the fence line ran close to the rim. His horse, steady-tempered in all the years Thomas had owned him, and familiar with that ground in every season, had evidently spooked, reared. Thomas had gone over the edge. Sheriff Dale Boone had ruled it an accident inside of 3 hours. These things happened in ranching country, he'd said. Horses were unpredictable creatures, even the reliable ones. Eliza sat with the journal open and read the last entry again, and then again. The second reading drove something in deeper than the first, and the third reading deeper still. Each pass of her eyes over those words functioning the way a nail functions when struck repeatedly. Not moving further each time, but embedding more completely, becoming more structural to the surrounding material. Her husband had known someone was coming for him, had gone to sleep on December 11th with that knowledge and the intention of addressing it the next morning. Had not made it to the next morning. The man who had ordered it had walked into her workroom this afternoon and looked at her 5-year-old daughter for 3 deliberate seconds. She closed the journal, set it on the table carefully, sat with her hands flat on the wood and her breathing slow and measured. The kind of breathing you practice when you're deciding what kind of person you will be. When you finally stand up from this table and walk back out into the world that just became a different place than you thought it was. Agnes Voss poured coffee into a chipped cup and slid it across the bar without being asked, which was one of the things Eliza had always appreciated about her. 50 years old, steel-gray hair cut short and worn without apology, eyes the color of good bourbon that missed very little and pretended to miss nothing. She ran the golden spur with the competence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by human behavior and had settled into a comfortable working understanding that people were largely going to do what they were going to do regardless of her opinion of the decision. She'd known Hank Stone once, in whatever capacity Eliza had never entirely mapped but understood the shape of, something that might have become one thing and had instead settled into something else. A road declined that had become a different kind of understanding between two people who respected each other enough not to require it to be anything more. Agnes kept a photograph behind the bar, turned face in against the wall, that Eliza had never seen the front of and had learned not to ask about. "You look like you're walking into a storm," Agnes said, reading whatever had arranged itself on Eliza's face with the accuracy of long familiarity. "I need to find Buck Harlan." The cup paused on its way back to the shelf. Iron Buck. Haven't heard that name come up in some time. Agnes set the cup down. Last I knew, he was living out on Canyon Road. Got a cabin back in the rocks up there. Keeps to himself since giving up the deputy badge. She looked at Eliza steadily. "What kind of help are you looking for?" Eliza set Thomas's journal on the bar and said nothing else. Agnes read it standing up, one hand resting on the wood, the other at her side. Her face moved through several things in sequence, none of them available to a stranger, all of them readable to Eliza after 11 years of knowing her. When she finished, she closed the journal and held it for a moment before sliding it back. Your father and I, she paused, the sentence finding its own pace. We had an understanding once. I loved him in a way that didn't go anywhere because he loved your mother, and that was the end of that conversation, and I respected him too much to make it complicated. Before your mother died, she asked something of me, made me promise I'd keep an eye on you, made me swear it. Agnes's hand settled flat on the bar, steady as ironwood. I keep my promises, Eliza. Always have. She refilled the cup. You go talk to Buck Harlan. I'll keep May safe until you're back. You have my word on it. Canyon Road went up into the hills north of Stone Creek, through stands of juniper and pinyon, the trees thickening and the air becoming marginally cooler as the elevation climbed. Enough to notice, not enough to be comfortable. The road narrowed to a track and then to something that required foreknowledge to find, a path that existed as information rather than as visible infrastructure. Eliza's mare picked her way through the rocks with the patient deliberateness of an animal that had decided to take nothing about the ground on faith. The cabin presented itself in a fold of hillside before she was expecting it, which told her something about how well it had been built. Rock walls the color of the surrounding stone. A single window facing the approach. A door set into shadow that even the midday sun would not reach until the angle shifted considerably. A thread of smoke from the chimney in defiance of the August heat, because whoever lived here operated according to his own logic and had for a long time. A lean hound came around the corner of the building before her mare had fully stopped, one eye gone milky with age. It assessed her without urgency, the evaluation of an animal conducting professional business. The door opened before she reached it. Buck Harlan was 62 years old and looked like someone had built him from materials that didn't match, but had agreed to hold together out of sheer accumulated stubbornness. Rope muscle and weathered skin, and a face that had been through a considerable number of things without apologizing for any of them. His left leg ended at the knee, replaced by a wooden peg worn dark with years of use. Fitted so precisely to his manner of moving that you stopped registering it within the first minute of watching him, which was likely the intention. He looked at her from the doorway without surprise or performance, the look of a man who had heard the horse on the track and had spent the intervening time deciding who it probably was. Eliza Stoneward. His voice was creek gravel and old timber. You look just like him. Same eyes. He stepped aside. Come in, call me Buck. The interior had been arranged by someone who thought carefully about what things were for. A cot, a table, a shelf holding books that looked genuinely read rather than merely owned. Ammunition beside the books, which said something about how he ordered his priorities. On the wall, a Remington revolver maintained to a standard that communicated its owner had not entirely retired from the possibility of using it. She gave him the journal, sat down, watched his face as he read it. His jaw worked once. Everything else held still. Thomas Ward was a good man. He set the journal on the table between them. Honest. The kind of honest that costs you something when you practice it in this territory. Did Marshall kill him? Had it done. Royce Marshall doesn't dirty his own hands. That's always been his particular skill. Maintaining enough distance between himself and the consequence that nothing sticks to him directly. The journal mentions a Colonel Brandt. Buck went still in the specific way of a man who has been waiting for a particular word to arrive and has been bracing for it without letting the bracing show. Not surprised, prepared. Where did you hear that name? Thomas wrote it. Said my father mentioned a Brandt once. Said to stay away. The old man sat down heavily across from her. A long pause followed, the kind that wasn't hesitation but gathering, pulling something up from where it had been stored for a considerable time. Colonel Silas Brandt, he said, the name, the way you say something that leaves a residue in the mouth, retired cavalry officer. Decorated in the Indian campaigns. The kind of decorated that means you were effective and didn't burden yourself with questions about what effectiveness required. He looked at her directly. In 1868, he came to your father, wanted Hank Stone to kill a business rival out of Denver, offer $10,000. Your father refused, called Brandt dishonorable, which he was and remains. What happened after my father refused? Brandt made threats. Said a man who refused him didn't have a long life ahead of him. Buck's eyes were level and certain and old. 3 years later, your father got sick. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Elias Penn, practicing here in Stone Creek at the time. Your father was healthy as a horse one day and dead inside a week. Penn signed the death certificate. Natural causes. The cabin walls seemed to draw inward. Brant was in Stone Creek that week. She said it without inflection because she already knew the answer. He was. And I've believed for 12 years what that means. But belief and proof are different currencies, and I've never had the second. Buck's hands rested on his thighs. Penn is still practicing here. He's known what he did and carried it for 12 years. Whether he kept any record of it, whether there's anything in that office connecting him to what happened to your father, I don't know. I've never had cause to look until now. Until now, Eliza sat with that for a moment. The chimney smoke, the old dog outside, the Remington on the wall maintained to a standard of readiness by a man who had given up his badge, but not apparently. Everything the badge had once represented. I need to learn to shoot. Buck looked at her for a long time without expression. Then, your father didn't want that life for you. My father is dead. She kept her voice flat. Not angry, just accurate. The way you state a physical fact about the landscape. My husband is dead. Royce Marshall walked into my shop yesterday and looked at my 5-year-old daughter for 3 seconds with an expression that told me exactly what category of problem she represents to him. She met his eyes and held them. I have roughly 2 weeks before he comes back. He told me so himself. Will you help me or not? Another pause. Longer than the first. His eyes moved to the window, then to the Remington, then back to her face. He stood, crossed to the wall, took the Remington down and placed it in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. The metal was cold against her palm in a way that felt like a statement. Her hand shook once, slightly, then stopped. Your father taught you awareness, Buck said. Taught you to watch rooms before entering them, to position yourself with exits in mind, to think before moving. Those are the hardest things to teach a person, and most people never fully learn them regardless of instruction. He studied the gun in her hands. The shooting is mechanics, learnable by anyone with patience. Then teach me the mechanics. Done properly, it takes weeks. Months, I have 2 weeks. That's when he said he'd come back. Something moved in Buck Harlan's expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape a smile would make if constructed from harder material. Then we start tomorrow at first light. 3 days in the canyon behind the cabin, working from sunrise until the August heat made the air shimmer and distort the sight lines past usefulness. Buck taught her to stand, which sounds simple and is not. The way weight distributes through the body tells the gun where it is going before the trigger is touched. And learning to plant yourself correctly is the first argument against the assumption that marksmanship is primarily a function of hands. He taught her breath control, how to exhale to a natural pause and hold there, the body momentarily at rest inside its own rhythm, the stillest point available in a system that is always moving. He taught her sight alignment, the geometry of front and rear sights that is exact and unforgiving and rewards patience over speed in the early stages. He taught her to draw without snagging fabric, the motion smooth and committed, because hesitation in the middle of a draw is more dangerous than hesitation before it begins. He taught her to reload under pressure, fingers working from memory rather than sight, because your eyes have better things to attend to in the moments that matter. On the third afternoon, something assembled itself. It didn't announce its arrival. She was standing at 20 paces with 5 empty tin cans arranged on a fence rail, and something in the combination of her hands and her stance and her breathing came together into a single coherent thing rather than several separate efforts happening simultaneously. She fired 5 times, 5 cans gone from the rail. Buck stood behind her and was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than she expected. Then, "You've got your father's hands." Something inhabited his voice that she would later identify as the sound a man makes when he encounters something he didn't expect to encounter, even when he'd been half expecting it. His eyes when he was sighting. His instinct for when the moment is right. Is that enough? He came to stand beside her, looking at the empty rail where the cans had been. Against most trouble that finds ordinary people, yes. Against professional killers hired by men with resources. He shook his head, and the honesty of it was something she valued more in that moment than reassurance would have been. Instinct and genetics get you to the room. What happens in the room is another matter. Then I need the Colt. It was your father's. If anyone in Stone Creek can fix it, it's Joseph Pike. He sold your father that piece back in 1865 and knows every component of it. He looked at her. But understand what you're asking. That gun was broken deliberately, by someone who had reasons. I know the reasons. She handed the Remington back to him. I'm going to ask him anyway. Joseph Pike's shop occupied a narrow storefront on the east end of Stone Creek's Main Street, announced by a sign repainted at different times in slightly different shades that had given it a layered quality over the years. The interior smelled of gun oil and metal filings, and the specific scent of a workspace that had absorbed decades of the same patient work. Pike himself was behind the counter when she arrived. A man in his late 60s bent over a disassembled mechanism under a mounted magnifying glass, a jeweler's loupe pushed up on his forehead where he'd forgotten it. When the door opened, he looked up and the loupe caught the afternoon light. She set the Colt on the counter. His hands went still. She knew before he said a word, knew from the way the stillness arrived, the quality of it. Not the stillness of a man encountering something unexpected, but the stillness of a man encountering something he had been half waiting to encounter for years, and had nevertheless not finished preparing for. Where did you get this? The words were buying him time rather than seeking information. It was my father's. He looked at her face with the thoroughness of someone reading a document carefully before responding to it. Flintstone's daughter. He set his tools down with the deliberateness of a man who needs his hands to be doing nothing while he speaks. I sold him this gun in 1865. He was not a man you forgot, your father. He had a quality about him that most men in most lines of work don't develop, a long breath. The hammer, he said it, and stopped there. I know, she said. I know you broke it. The words landed between them with a weight out of all proportion to their brevity. 3 days before Hank Stone died, Pike said carefully, he came to my shop at closing time, paid me $20, told me to break the hammer clean at the base. No partial break that someone clever could work around, but clean and complete. And he made me swear I would never fix it myself and never allow anyone else to fix it, and would never tell anyone I had done it. He looked at the gun between them. He was very specific about the swearing. Your father was a man who understood the difference between us made casually and a promise made to last. The shop had a quality she would remember afterward as airless, though the door stood open and the window was unlatched, and August moved through it without obstruction. The sounds of the street outside existed in a register that felt disconnected from what was happening inside this room. He left something for you. Pike moved to a cabinet behind him, opened a small locked drawer with a key from his watch chain. The envelope inside had gone the color of old cream, the particular yellow that takes careful storage and considerable time to achieve. Her name on the front in her father's handwriting, the careful script he had developed over years of keeping precise records that she had always meant to ask him about and never had. She took the envelope, opened it standing at the counter. 1 page. His hand, but composed differently than his usual letters to her. The writing of a man who had revised this in his head many times before putting pen to paper, every word carrying the weight of something that might be the last thing. Eliza, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I believe I know what's coming and I've made my peace with it, as well as a man can make peace with a thing he didn't choose. I broke this gun so you'd live peaceful, so you'd never have to walk the path I walked. That path ends with me. I wanted that for you more than most things I've wanted in my life. But I also know that sometimes the world doesn't let a person choose. If you've come to this shop asking Joseph to fix this, then peace ran out and the world made choices for you without your permission. If that's where you are, fix it, use it, survive. But know, my girl, that every shot changes you. Every violent thing done in the world takes something from you that doesn't return the same way it left. This is not a reason to refuse the fight when the fight is necessary. It's simply the price. Know the price before you pay it, and choose wisely when you can. I love you always. I have always been most proud of you for the things that had nothing to do with guns. Pa. She read it twice. On the second reading, her vision blurred and she blinked it clear, with the specific determination of someone who has decided against something in a public place and is holding that decision as a matter of principle. On the third reading, she understood it fully. Not the words, which she had understood immediately, but the love behind the construction of it, the care with which her father had built an exit for her, even from a situation he had tried to prevent her from ever entering. He had known, not suspected. known with enough certainty to make preparations 3 days before the end. Had spent those 3 days making sure that the daughter he was leaving behind would have options when she needed them, even though offering those options required undoing the protection he had spent years constructing. He had broken the gun to keep her safe, and he had left the letter so that when safety ran out, she would know she had his permission for whatever came next. She folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope. "Can you fix it?" Her voice came out more steadily than her hands would have suggested was possible. Pike looked at the Colt, then at her face, running the arithmetic of a man weighing a promise against a situation and finding that the situation had changed the variables significantly. "Your father was my friend, the kind of friend who tells you the truth, even when the truth costs him something." Another pause. "He wanted peace for you. He wanted you clear of all of it. I know. He'd have opinions about this. He'd also understand it." She met his eyes. "Would he have wanted May to grow up without a mother because I was too careful about honoring what he wanted for me?" The old man was quiet for a long time. The gun sat on the counter between them, patient as only objects can be. "Come back tomorrow morning. Bring it with you." He reached beneath the counter and set something else on the wood beside the Colt. A small Derringer, 2-shot, old but maintained to the same standard as everything else in his shop. "Take this tonight. Don't put it in your bag where you have to search for it. Put it in your right boot where your hand already knows to go." A man who has been making and repairing guns for 40 years learns one thing before he learns anything else. He met her eyes directly. One gun is never the entirety of a plan. She paid him, picked up the Derringer, fitted it into her right boot where it settled against her ankle with the specific, unambiguous weight of something that is exactly what it is and makes no claims to being anything else. She walked out of Pike's shop into the August heat of Stone Creek's Main Street and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the sun pressing down and the town conducting its late afternoon business around her as though nothing had shifted in the last 48 hours, as though the world Eliza had been living in before she opened Thomas's box was still the same world. She was 33 years old. She was her father's daughter. She went home to make May supper and wait for whatever came next to come. It came 3 hours after May fell asleep. Not a large fire, a strategic one, the kind set by people who have a specific goal rather than a desire to burn everything to the ground. The smell reached her first, the sharp sweetness of burning structural wood rather than cooking wood. And then the sound below, voices held low with the deliberate quiet of people trying not to be heard, which has its own acoustic signature entirely distinct from actual quiet. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. Pulled on her dress without lighting the lamp. Her hand found the Colt on the bedside table. The fixed Colt, the one she'd collected from Pike that morning, clean and oiled and complete with its new hammer, the one that was her father's and was now hers, May 1st, always May 1st. She crossed to the back room on quiet feet and crouched beside the small bed where her daughter slept on her side with the wooden doll tucked against her chest. She put her hand over May's mouth before waking her, the way you do when you need someone to understand silence before they understand anything else. May's eyes opened, found her mother's face in the dark. Read it with the comprehensive literacy of 5 years spent studying one person's expressions above all others. She did not make a sound. "Stay here," Eliza mouthed. "Don't move, don't speak." She held May's gaze until she was certain the instructions had fully arrived, then stood and walked to the door of the room. From below, 3 voices. Close enough now to hear their shape. "Just scare her." Boss said, "Don't kill her yet. Just make her understand the situation." A different voice, amused in the lazy way of someone who found fear in others entertaining. "What if she's got that gun? Her daddy's gun?" A third voice, the easiest laugh in the group. "That thing's been broken for years. She's a seamstress. What's she going to do, stitch us to death?" Laughter. Comfortable. Certain. The laughter of men who have done this kind of errand before and found it straightforward. Footsteps on the stairs. 3 sets. Heavy on the treads and not bothering with quiet anymore. The change in posture of people who have shifted from approach to what they believe will be execution of a simple task. Eliza walked to the door of May's room, opened it, and stepped into the smoke-threaded hallway. 3 men. Young, all of them barely into their mid-20s, cowboys who had traded something they likely hadn't understood the value of for whatever Marshall was paying, which she doubted was enough for what this was about to cost them. They stopped when they saw her. Recalibrated in real time, the adjustment visible in their postures before it reached their expressions. Well now. The tallest one, working to recover his smile. Looks like the widow's got some teeth. The middle one looked at the gun in her hand, at the hammer that was present and intact. That's Flintstone's gun. The third one, that gun's been broken. Everyone in this county knows it. She cocked the hammer. The sound it made in that enclosed hallway was the loudest thing in the room, louder than it had any physical right to be. It was broken. Her voice came from somewhere she hadn't known existed in her until 3 days ago in a canyon with 5 tin cans. I fixed it. The three of them looked at each other, not at her, at each other, because they had been told this was going to be one kind of task, and it was becoming a different kind entirely, and they needed consensus on how to proceed, and consensus was not forming quickly. The tallest one's hand moved toward his hip. She shot him in the leg. The percussion in that enclosed hallway was enormous, a sound that reorganized every other sound in the building into categories of before and after. He went down with a shout that became something sustained and ragged. The other two froze. From the exterior stairs, a door banging open, and Buck Harlan's voice, rough and carrying the specific authority of a man who has used it in difficult situations before. Anyone still standing in that hallway who isn't Eliza Ward better be moving toward the exit right now. The punctuation of his shotgun chambering made the instruction concrete. The two standing men grabbed the one on the floor between them and got him down the stairs with the efficiency of people who had very rapidly revised their assessment of the situation. The front door of the shop below, opening and closing, then quiet. The smoke still drifted at the edges of the hallway. Knocked-over lamp had caught the corner of a fabric bolt near the front window. Agnes Voss, who had apparently been in the street when the smoke started, arrived with a bucket of well water and addressed it before it became catastrophic. Half the front room was damaged. The bolt of ivory silk she'd been working with was gone. The half-finished wedding dress for the alderman girl was ash. Eliza stood in the hallway with her father's gun still raised, smoke moving around her in thin ribbons. Her hands were steady. Then, in the silence after, they weren't. Buck caught her elbow before she went sideways. "Easy, I've got you." His voice had the quality of a man who has stood in difficult places many times and learned what to do with his voice in them. "You did what needed doing. I shot him. You wounded him. You gave him a reason to leave that didn't involve a body on your floor." He steadied her against the wall. "That's more mercy than some situations call for." Her knees wanted to go somewhere. She did not let them. Because in the back room, May was waiting with her wooden doll and the obedient silence of a child who had been told not to make a sound and was taking the instruction entirely seriously. In the ruined front room, the bolt of ivory silk still smoldered at one corner, the fabric that would have been someone's wedding dress, curling and blackening at its edges. The lamp was broken on the floor. The scissors she'd set down hours ago were still on the cutting table, exactly where she'd placed them. The Colt in her hand was warm. She had shot a man, had stood in the hallway of her own shop and fired her dead father's gun at a living person, and the world had continued to be the world afterward, unchanged by what she had just done to it. Her father's letter, "Every shot changes you. Every violent thing done in the world takes something from you that doesn't return the same way." She understood it differently now than she had reading it at Pike's counter. She understood it from the inside, from the part of yourself that the understanding lives in once it's arrived. She lowered the gun, went to May's door, opened it. Her daughter sat exactly where she'd been left, against the far wall with her knees drawn up and the wooden doll held tight, watching the door with those wide grey-green eyes that were Hank Stone's eyes passed down through a generation. Eliza crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her daughter and pulled her in with the thoroughness of someone holding the one thing, all the decisions that have led to this particular moment in this particular hallway on this particular night. May didn't ask what had happened. She was 5 years old and already possessed of a sufficient understanding of the world to know that some questions were going to need more time before they could be answered properly. Outside, Stone Creek settled back into its August night, the Silver Dollars piano, the horses, the wind coming down from the canyon carrying the smell of pine and distance and the particular cool of elevated ground. Inside, on the hallway floor, the Colt lay where Eliza had set it down. The hammer was whole, the action was clean and ready, It was her father's gun. Now it was hers, and somewhere in the dark of Stone Creek. 2 men were riding back to Royce Marshall's Double C Ranch to tell him that the widow with the seamstress hands had done something none of them had been prepared for. That the gun everyone knew was broken wasn't broken anymore. That Flintstone's daughter had found her inheritance after all. Agnes didn't ask for an explanation when Eliza arrived before sunrise with May on her hip and a carpetbag over one shoulder, and the Colt at her waist, and the expression of a woman who has made several irreversible decisions in the past 4 hours and has not yet had coffee. She just opened the door wider, which was the right thing, the only thing. And Eliza had known that about Agnes Voss for 11 years, since Thomas had introduced them at the county fair the summer before their wedding, since Agnes had shaken her hand and looked at her with those bourbon-colored eyes and said, without preamble, "Your father is a good man," which was the entirety of the endorsement Eliza had apparently needed to earn her permanent regard. The room above the Golden Spur smelled of old cedar and candle wax, and something faintly floral that Eliza suspected was a deliberate choice Agnes had made about what the space above her business would smell like, regardless of what happened below it. 2 beds, a window facing the alley rather than the main street, which was better. A latch on the door that functioned properly, which was considerably better still. May went back to sleep inside of 10 minutes, the wooden doll tucked against her collarbone, her breathing evening out with the absolute trust of a child who has decided that wherever her mother puts her down is the right place to be. Eliza sat on the edge of the other bed and did not sleep at all. She sat with the Colt across her knees and thought about the entry in Thomas's journal that she had read enough times that it had stopped being words and become something structural, a load-bearing fact, fitted into her understanding of the past 2 years. Ward disposed. Final payment $300. The economy of it. 2 words for a man who had carved a doll for his daughter by lamplight and memorized the catalogue of Eliza's expressions the way people memorize things they intend to keep forever. Who had believed with his whole, careful, honest heart that the world rewarded people who did their part of it right. Disposed as though he were a line item rather than a person who had mattered in specific, irreplaceable ways to the specific people who had known him. She was still sitting there when the light under the door shifted from black to gray to the pale gold of Stone Creek at 7 in the morning, and Buck Harlan arrived at 1:30, which meant he had ridden through the night from his cabin with his leg and his shotgun, and the unhurried patience of a man who had decided something needed doing and had started doing it before anyone could suggest he rest. He moved to the window and stood to one side of it, the position of a man checking angles rather than admiring a view. His knee, she noticed, had a fresh wrapping of cloth around it. Not the previous night's bandage, but a new one, tighter, the kind of replacement you make when the original has been through more than it was designed for. She pointed at it. He looked at it briefly and said it had stopped a piece of the broken lamp during the previous night's events. A cut rather than anything serious, which she suspected was the version of the truth he had selected rather than the whole of it. She did not argue. She had learned that Buck Harlan's assessment of his own condition was a sovereign territory she was not yet welcome to dispute. Agnes brought coffee and 3 plates of eggs without commentary, set them on the table, and sat down herself in the way of a woman who has decided she is part of this conversation whether it has been formally opened to include her or not. They were still at the table when the door opened. Will Ward was 24 years old and had, for one arrested moment when he stepped through the doorway, a resemblance to Thomas so structural and immediate that the air went briefly out of Eliza's chest. Same jaw, same way of carrying the shoulders. The Ward family's architecture written into the bone in ways that persisted across the generation between them. But Thomas had worn his face with the settled quality of a man who had found what he was looking for and knew it. Will's face was scored by something else, guilt with its particular erosive quality, the way it hollows a person gradually from the inside until you can see the shape of it from the outside. He stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and the look of a man who has been rehearsing his opening sentence and has just realized no rehearsal was going to make it adequate. I should have been here. His voice arrived in the room without preamble. When Thomas died, I was working cattle drives in the Panhandle. Someone wired me 2 days after the funeral. A pause. The hat rotated once in his hands. I told myself there was nothing I could have done. I told myself that for 8 months. Then I heard what happened last night and rode through it, Buck, from the window without turning. How long were you in the Panhandle before Thomas died? 18 months. Took work where I found it. Will's jaw set in a way that was entirely Thomas. He wrote me last October. Said everything was fine, ranch doing well, the family healthy. His eyes found Eliza across the table. He didn't tell me about Marshall, didn't tell me about any of it, because Thomas wouldn't have. That was accurate without being any comfort. Thomas had possessed a particular brand of protectiveness that expressed itself as silence, as keeping the difficult things in his own hands so other people's hands could remain unburdened. She had loved that quality in him and occasionally wanted to argue with it, and now it sat between them in Agnes Voss's upstairs room as a fact she could not change and could not entirely forgive him for. Though the forgiveness was beside the point, he was going to handle it himself, she said. He was riding to find Buck the morning he died. He didn't get the chance. Will Ward looked at her with the expression of a man absorbing something he had known in outline and is only now understanding in the specific physical way that matters. Then he put his hat on the table, pulled out the remaining chair, and sat down. Tell me what you need. The simplicity of it was the point. That's why I'm here, for him and for you and May. Tell me what you need done, which was the right answer. Eliza noted it, filed it, returned to the problem at hand. Royce Marshall came to the Golden Spur alone, no men flanking him, no visible hardware, though that observation meant nothing about a man who planned as carefully as he did. Just himself, mid-morning, arriving 3 days after he'd stood in her workroom and looked at May for 3 seconds too long. He walked through the saloon bar without acknowledging Agnes, who was restocking the back shelves, with the focused attention of a woman who notices everything and responds to nothing she hasn't decided to respond to. Eliza came downstairs when Agnes sent May to the back room with instructions to count the bottles on the bottom shelf, a task May approached with the concentrated solemnity she brought to anything numerical. Buck stayed upstairs. His explanation was brief and did not invite discussion. Marshall knows I'm involved. Me sitting in plain view narrows his options and changes how he negotiates. Better I remain a variable he has to account for, without knowing exactly where I am. Will stayed upstairs as well, for a different reason that Buck had articulated and Will had agreed with. He was still unknown in this particular conflict. Unknown was a resource. You did not spend a resource before you understood what it was worth. Eliza sat at the table nearest the bar. The Colt was at her hip. She did not make a production of its presence. It was simply there as it had been for the past several days, which was the only point worth making about it. Marshall sat across from her with the ease of a man who intended to control the atmosphere of any room he occupied regardless of whose room it technically was. He looked at her for a moment with the flat assessment she recognized from the workroom. Not quite looking at a person, more like looking at a set of conditions and calculating their implications. You shot my employee, your employee burned my shop. He was overzealous. The word sat where an apology would have sat, occupying the space without performing the function. I've spoken to him about it. Tell him I'm sorry about his leg. Her voice carried no inflection that suggested she was sorry about his leg in any meaningful way. While you're having that conversation, something moved in Marshall's expression and then didn't move again. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, the posture of a man settling into a conversation whose length he intends to control. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I'm conducting legitimate business in this county, and I've been doing so for 2 years. There have been obstacles. I'm interested in clearing those obstacles in a way that works for everyone involved. By murdering my husband, the silence that followed had a texture that the previous silences in the conversation had not. I don't know what you're talking about. Perfectly level. The voice of a man who has said this specific sentence, or sentences indistinguishable from it, enough times that it has become entirely reflexive. Thomas Ward died in a ranching accident. Sheriff Boone made that determination conclusively. Thomas kept a journal. She watched his face when she said it. Watched the thing that moved there before he could prevent it. A small contraction around the eyes that a less practiced observer might have read as nothing. He wrote about you. About the survey markers on his eastern section. About a man from Denver he saw arguing with you outside Grayson's assayer office. She let one full beat pass. A Colonel Brandt, the name landed. She had expected some response, some adjustment of the expression. What she got was more complete than she'd prepared for. Royce Marshall. In the 3 seconds following that name, went through something not visible from the outside but present nonetheless. The way extreme cold is present in the quality of the air before the temperature registers on skin. Fear, not of her, of something behind her that she had just named aloud in a room where names had consequences. You should leave Stone Creek, Mrs. Ward. The smoothness was back, but retrieving it had cost him something. She could see the cost in the slight tightening of his jaw. Take your daughter somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. You're a talented seamstress. You could establish yourself in any number of towns that would suit you better than this one. This is my town. Not for much longer. He stood, unhurried, controlled, designed to communicate that the conversation was concluding, cause he had decided it was concluding. You have 3 days. After that, what happens isn't something I'll be in a position to prevent. He walked out through the bar without acknowledging Agnes, who was still restocking with the same focused attention. Not one motion altered by his passage through the room. The door closed. Buck's footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway and read the room and read her face in one continuous sweep. He's scared. Not of you, of Brandt. You said the name and it moved something in him that he couldn't quite put back. He moved to the window, checked the street outside with the habitual glance of someone who never entirely stops doing reconnaissance. That's still scared. Scared men make mistakes. The question is whether we can use his mistakes before he corrects them. Will, from the top of the stairs, the ledger. If Marshall keeps records of what he's paid and to whom, those records connect him to Thomas's death. To the Silver Survey. To Brandt's involvement, every man in his position keeps a ledger, Buck said. Paper between himself and what he's ordered done, so he can argue distance if things go wrong. It'll be in his ranch house. Has to be, so we go get it, Will said. The directness of 24 years old, which was not stupidity but the compression of a decision into its simplest form. We go get it, Buck confirmed, his tone doing the necessary qualification work without editorializing. Tomorrow night. Dot said Marshall, plays cards at the Silver Dollar every Thursday, Agnes, still at the back shelves, without turning. He plays cards at the Silver Dollar every Thursday, stays until at least midnight. Has done for 3 years without exception. She aligned a bottle on the shelf with small, precise adjustment. I keep a calendar. A pause in the room. Tomorrow's Thursday, Will noted. Yes, Agnes said. It is. The WWII ranch sat behind a low rise of scrubland that blocked it from the road and created, for anyone approaching on foot, an unavoidable 30 yards of open ground between the last available cover and the ranch house wall. Marshall had built it that way. Structures like this were not built for hospitality. They were built by men who had spent enough time thinking about what might come for them that the thinking had become architecture. To 2 guards on the perimeter. Eliza counted their circuit from behind a water trough with Will flat beside her on the ground and the August dark pressing down with a weight that felt different from the dark inside a building. More total, more honest about what it was. The guards moved with the boredom of men conducting an errand they considered theoretical. Rifles slung, voices carrying in fragments across the 30 yards between them and the trough. Something about money owed on a card game. Something about a horse with a bad left foreleg. Nothing about vigilance. Agnes had confirmed it before they'd left. Marshall was at the Silver Dollar. Into his second whiskey by 8 o'clock and into his third hand of cards by 8:30, comfortable and generous with his tips in the way he only was when he felt entirely secure about his evening. He would not be back before midnight. They had roughly 2 hours, possibly less if the card game went wrong for him. The guards completed their circuit and disappeared around the far side of the barn, 30 yards of open ground. Eliza moved first, low and committed, the motion complete before any second thought could interrupt it. She had learned something in the canyon with Buck that applied equally here. The decision either happens before you move, or it doesn't happen properly at all. Will followed close, matching her pace precisely. Close enough that she could monitor his breathing without turning her head. His breathing was controlled. Not the quick, shallow rhythm of someone managing fear badly, pushing it down while it pushed back. Steady and deliberate. The breathing of someone who had crossed open ground before under conditions that didn't forgive mistakes, for reasons he hadn't mentioned and she hadn't asked about. She filed this as information about Will Ward that was worth having. The office window was unlatched. Of course it was. Men like Marshall locked the formal entries and left the secondary ones open because they believed in their own reputation as a perimeter, and because the people employed to enforce that perimeter had been paid to share that belief, and because until 3 days ago there had been no particular reason for anyone to reconsider the arrangement. Eliza went through first, dropping silently to the floorboards inside. Will followed, less elegant in the entry, but quiet enough that the difference didn't matter. They stopped, listened to the building around them for a full 10 seconds, counting the sounds. The tick of an expensive clock on the wall, the sound of wind in the eaves, one of the horses in the barn settling its weight in a stall. The office smelled of embedded cigar smoke and old leather and the faint metallic quality of a room where significant amounts of money had been handled regularly over many years. A massive desk occupied the center, its surface kept clear except for a business ledger, an inkwell, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey left out with the casual confidence of a man who wanted visitors to notice he could afford the good kind. Behind a landscape painting hung on the east wall, green rolling hills that bore no relationship to any terrain within 500 miles of Stone Creek, a safe was set into the wall, iron, substantial. The product of a manufacturer who understood that the people buying their safes had specific and well-founded concerns about unauthorized access. Eliza looked at it for a moment, her father's voice, warm and precise in her memory, instructing a 12-year-old in a skill she hadn't understood she would one day need. Feel for the pins. Each one moves different from the others. Listen with your fingers because your ears are going to be occupied with worrying and won't be reliable. She pulled 2 hairpins from her hair, bent them to the angles she needed, and went to work. The first pin found in 40 seconds. The second took 2 full minutes, which felt considerably longer than 2 minutes while it was happening. Will had moved to the window and stood at the edge of it, watching the guard's route without being visible from outside, his reflection barely a suggestion in the dark glass. Outside voices, the guards completing their circuit, passing within 20 feet of the window. A laugh about something she couldn't quite catch, the sound of 2 men who had talked each other out of alertness over too many uneventful nights. The voices moved on and faded. 3rd pin. 4th. The 5th took 4 minutes on its own. An obstinate mechanism that required a specific angle she found by accident and then lost and found again by the method of stopping trying to find it and letting her fingers move without the interference of active searching. She was right that her father had never taught her to shoot. He had, without either of them understanding what he was doing, taught her everything else. Click, the safe door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Inside, property deeds stacked in sequence, land contracts tied with twine, a sheaf of correspondence, and beneath all of it, a second ledger bound in dark brown leather, kept separate from the desk ledger the way a man keeps 2 different sets of books when the 2 sets are recording 2 different categories of transaction. She carried it to the window where the moonlight was sufficient, barely, opened it. The entries were dated and specific, written in Marshall's own hand with the methodical confidence of a man who believed this record would remain private, who kept it because men like him always keep some private accounting of what they have done and what it has cost and what it has produced, because the alternative is carrying it all in memory, and memory is less reliable than paper. July 10, 1879. Payment to B. Sutton, Ward problem, $200 advance, August 15, 1879. Assayer confirmation, Ward property east section, silver deposit confirmed, high-grade ore. Estimated yield $50,000 over 15-year extraction period. She read that entry twice, $50,000. Beneath Thomas's ranch, beneath the land he had fenced and improved and managed with the care of a man building something for his daughter to inherit. He had died not knowing it existed, had been killed for it without ever learning what it was that had gotten him killed. December 12, 1879. Ward disposed. Final payment B. Sutton, $300. Property acquisition initiated. Ward disposed. The same 2 words from the journal, but now in Marshall's own handwriting, composed with the same casual confidence as every other entry on every other page. The handwriting of a man who had never expected anyone else to read this. Will's hand closed briefly on her arm. His voice dropped to barely audible. Eliza. This she followed where he was pointing. November 1872. Callaway matter. Arsenic Procurement and Administration, Dr. E. Penn, $300. Per Colonel S. Brandt's direction. Completed satisfactorily, Calloway Matter. Her father, Jack Hank Stone, who had been called Flint Calloway by some in other territories. The name that had followed him, the name the legend had attached to him. $300. Per Brandt's direction. Completed satisfactorily. The room did something that had nothing to do with the room. Will had his notebook out already, the small one from his vest pocket that he carried, because Thomas had told him to always carry one, because you will see things worth remembering, and your memory will lie to you about them later. He was copying. Fast, his pen moving down the page in the compressed handwriting of someone who writes quickly under time pressure. Dates, amounts, names. Not every entry. They didn't have time for every entry. The ones that formed a chain, the ones with names attached, the ones that showed not a single act but a sustained pattern of decisions and payments and outcomes. They worked for 11 minutes. Long enough. Enough to have what they needed. Then the floorboard in the hallway outside the office door registered wait. One sound. The specific note of a board that knew this floor and knew which ones to step over and had missed this particular one by a fraction. They froze. Will's pen stopped mid-letter. Aziza's hand went to the Colt. The door came open, not a perimeter guard. Two men, suited, standing in the doorway with the stillness of people who have arrived to find something and are finding it. Their eyes moved over the room without surprise, with the expression of men who had come specifically here for specifically this purpose. Well, the first one's voice carried no effect. Professional in the cleanest sense. A man who was very good at a specific job that did not have a polite name. Didn't figure it'd be a woman and a ranch hand. Will's hand moved toward his side. The second man's revolver cleared leather before the motion was complete. Don't flat and certain as a fence post. Mr. Marshall said alive if it's manageable. He's not fixed on it. Eliza raised her hand slowly, deliberately, communicating compliance without performing fear, which was a distinction she had decided mattered even though she couldn't have explained precisely why. The ledger sat on the desk beside her. She needed it back in the safe before they noticed it had been moved, needed them to find her in a room with an open safe and conclude she had failed to get into it rather than succeeded. Step away from the desk. Both of you. They stepped away. The first man collected the Colt from her hip and Will's revolver from his belt, with the efficient movements of someone who has disarmed people before and understands which items matter. He picked up the ledger from the desk, flipped through it with the casual interest of a man confirming a thing exists rather than reading it, and set it back down. He had not looked at the painting. Had not noticed the safe behind it, still open. Door swung out at an angle that the painting's frame partially concealed from the doorway. The second man to the first. What were they looking for? The first man looked at Eliza, waiting for the answer that would tell him how much she knew and how much of a problem that represented. Proof, she said. Simple, accurate as far as it went. That Marshall killed my husband, and did you find any? Just papers I can't make sense of. She let her eyes move to the ledger with the expression of someone who has encountered something beyond her professional competence. Business figures. Nothing that meant anything to me. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She held his gaze for all 3 of them. Why would a seamstress know how to read a land speculation and transaction ledger? In Will's vest pocket, pressed against his ribs. 11 minutes of copied entries. Every significant name, every date, every amount. Get the boss, the first man said to the second. Tell him we found them in the office. Tell him the situation is contained. Then to Eliza and Will, you two are going to the barn, move. The barn was dark in the complete way of structures built without windows. A darkness that had weight and texture to it, the smell of hay and horse, and the combination of old wood and dry dust that accumulates in any building used consistently over years for the same purpose. They were pushed inside and the bar dropped across the outer door with a finality that required no interpretation. Will's voice found her in the dark, working at steadiness and not entirely achieving it. I still have the notebook, she had known. Had felt him tuck it back into his vest when the men came through the office door. The small, deliberate shift of his elbow, the motion unhurried despite the guns being produced, the action of someone keeping the most important things safe while everything else became complicated. Thomas had told her about this quality in his brother, the capacity to hold the center of a problem when the edges were going in every direction. She had believed it in the abstract. She had evidence now. They searched for weapons and assumed that covered it, she said. Men like that don't think about notebooks. A pause. I don't think they found the derringer either, her right boot. The two-shot derringer pike had pressed into her hand, with the instruction to put it somewhere that didn't require searching for it. The men had taken the Colt at her hip, and Will's revolver at his belt, and had considered the accounting complete. No, she confirmed. They didn't. From outside, voices. The perimeter guards, informed of the situation, gathered now at the front of the property. From further away, the sound of a horse being ridden fast from the direction of town. More than one horse, the rhythm of a small group moving with purpose. Shale. Coming back from the Silver Dollar ahead of schedule, which meant someone had gotten word to him, which meant his operation had more layers than the two men in the office represented. They'll burn it. She kept her voice below the level that would carry through barn walls. That's what they did to the shop. Drive us out into the open, Will already thinking ahead of her. They won't burn it with the horses inside. They'll move the horses first or leave them and burn it anyway. But either way there's a window, the rear of the barn. A mucking door, low clearance, used for removing waste material. Not down as an exit for people under pressure, but serving that function by virtue of existing on the opposite side of the building from the front entrance where the armed men were gathering. She moved toward where the door had to be, navigating by memory of barn architecture rather than sight, one hand trailing along the stall boards. A horse shifted in the nearest stall, picking up the tension in the air with the emotional accuracy that horses apply to human states. Registering what the humans in the building were feeling before any of them had spoken it aloud, found the door by feel. The latch was a simple iron bar in iron brackets, the kind of hardware that had been doing the same job for 20 years without being asked to do anything else. Outside, Marshall's voice arrived from the front of the property, carrying with the authority of a man who expects his instructions to be followed before the echoes settle. The words didn't come through the walls clearly, just the shape of them. The cadence of someone giving orders to people who knew better than to ask questions about them. Then, clearly, cutting through the barn walls as though they weren't there. Kill them quietly. I want them gone before morning. Get them out of the barn first and then burn it. I won't have blood in the stalls. Will's hand found her arm in the darkness, his breath against her ear. Now, she lifted the bar, pulled the door open, moonlight, and a man standing directly outside with a lit torch in one hand and a revolver in the other, in the process of following an order he had been given 30 seconds ago. He had not expected the door to open from the inside. That gap between expectation and reality was the only interval they had. Will hit the door at full speed with his shoulder, his left shoulder, leading with the mass of him rather than with any technique. And the man went backward with his torch going one direction and his revolver going another. Will went after the revolver and reached it with his left hand first, which was the only part of that exchange that determined anything. Eliza was already moving. Out the door, low, angling away from the barn wall toward the equipment shed 30 yards east, putting the shed between herself and the men she could hear reorganizing on the far side of the building. Behind her, Will fired once. The sound enormous in the open night air, and then was running. She reached the shed, pressed flat against the wall. Scanned the yard. Will, 15 yards away and moving toward her, his left hand still gripping the revolver and his right arm drawn in against his body at the shoulder. The involuntary posture of someone who has just taken a bullet into the right side of the chest and is managing the new information. Blood on his shirt in the moonlight, spreading from the right shoulder at a pace that had opinions about urgency. Two of Marshall's men were advancing from the south side of the property, with the patient efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that patience was more effective than speed in open ground situations. Between them and Eliza, the open yard. Behind her the shed wall, then from the darkness beyond the eastern fence line, at the limit of the firelight's reach, a shotgun fired twice in the pattern she recognized from 3 days in the canyon, the rhythm of Buck Harlan working a shotgun with economy, each shot placed rather than panicked. Agnes Voss's Winchester answered from the north tree line, once, then again, systematic and unhurried, the shooting of a woman who had made a decision about what she was going to do tonight and was doing it without drama. They had not been told to follow. Buck had told her something once, on the first morning in the canyon, that she had understood as philosophy and now understood as operational. You plan for the outcome you want, then you prepare for everything the plan doesn't account for. The two men advancing from the south scattered toward cover as fire came at them from two directions they hadn't anticipated. The barnyard, which had been geometrically hostile to Eliza 30 seconds ago, was reorganizing itself in a direction that was away from her rather than toward her. Buck's voice from the eastern darkness, pitched to carry exactly far enough. East Ridge. Horses, she reached Will and matched his pace without comment. Close but not taking his weight, because this was not the help this moment called for, and she had learned enough about Will Ward to know that offering it would cost them both more than it gained. He was moving adequately. That was the measure that mattered right now. The eastern fence was 100 yards. They covered it with gunfire continuing behind them. Buck and Agnes working from positions that kept Marshall's remaining men occupied with problems closer to home than the two figures crossing toward the tree line, 4 horses in the trees beyond the fence, saddled and waiting. Because Buck had watched the approach and read the property, and had spent the intervening time making the exit that this particular entry had always been going to require. Will got into his saddle with his left arm doing the work that both arms were supposed to share, his right hand resting in his lap with the careful stillness of someone who has been told by his body that movement in that area is currently inadvisable. The mounting cost him something that showed briefly in the compression of his jaw and didn't show again, because Will Ward had decided it wasn't going to show again and had enforced that decision. Agnes was already mounted, her Winchester across the saddlebow, her expression the same one she used when conducting inventory, present, methodical. Not a woman who considered what she had just done to be outside the ordinary range of what a Thursday evening might require. Buck came out of the tree line on his horse, at a controlled run, reloading the shotgun with the smooth practice of someone who has been reloading under time pressure for 3 decades. He looked at Will's right shoulder and then at Eliza and said nothing, which was the assessment of a man who had already calculated what needed to happen next and was allocating his words accordingly. Then he looked at his own left knee, where something in the confrontation at the eastern fence had opened a cut through his trouser leg. A rock fragment or a ricochet, impossible to know which in this light, and pressed his palm against it with the same practicality he applied to everything and turned his horse east. They rode, pushing the horses at a pace that covered ground quickly, without asking more than the animals could sustain over distance. Behind them, the fire that had caught the dry grass near the barn wall made its own decisions in the August night, spreading with the indifference of something that does not recognize the distinction between what was supposed to burn and what wasn't. Eliza looked back once when they crested the first rise. The Double C ranch yard was lit orange in the middle distance. Men running with buckets, Marshall's voice audible even at this range as a quality of sound rather than words. The sound of a man whose evening had gone in a direction he had not arranged for. She faced forward. Then she pulled her horse back to a walk for just a moment, just long enough to press both hands flat against the saddle horn and breathe 2 full breaths, the kind of breathing you do when you need to put something down before you can carry what comes next. She had just been inside a burning barn with men trying to kill her. She had run across open ground under fire. She had watched Will take a bullet and keep moving. All of it had happened, and none of it had fully arrived yet. Not the fear and not the relief, both of them queued behind the immediate work of covering distance. And she acknowledged them both and then set them aside. Later, she would have them later. Will's horse had drawn up alongside hers in the brief moment she'd slowed. He looked at her with his left hand loose on the reins and his right arm motionless and his expression doing the thing it did when he was deciding whether to say something. He decided against it. She was grateful for that. Some acknowledgments were made by simply continuing to ride together, which was what they did. She did not look back again. Redstone was a mining town a day and a half's hard ride east of Stone Creek. Far enough outside Marshall's immediate operational territory to be genuinely useful as a place to stop. Close enough that the distance back when the time came would not be impossible. They arrived before noon the second day, horses lathered, and Will's right shoulder having made its opinions known at increasing volume over the final miles of the journey. Dr. Samuel Reed practiced out of a room attached to the dry goods store on Redstone's Main Street. He was 50 years old, gray-haired, with the competence of someone who had been doing a job long enough that excellence had become unremarkable to him. He asked Will 2 questions. How long ago, and is the bullet still in there? After the answers, he simply worked. The bullet was out of Will's right shoulder in 40 minutes. Reed's hand steady throughout with the steadiness of a man for whom this was Tuesday. Will ran a fever the second night. The kind that comes when the body has decided it has opinions about what has been done to it and intends to express those opinions at volume. Eliza sat beside him through the night of it, doing the arithmetic of concern without a useful variable to calculate against, setting cold compresses on his forehead and counting his breaths and listening to the building settle around them in the language of old structures adjusting to the temperature drop after midnight. She thought about Thomas during those hours. Not the grief version of thinking about him, not the absence, the shape of the space where he had been, the factual version, his hands, the way he went quiet when something worried him, a quality of silence different from his other silences, the one she had learned to read before he'd learned to tell her what was behind it. He would have done this, would have sat beside a person in need of someone beside them and done the patient work of simply remaining present. It was his brother she was sitting beside. She noticed this, did not resolve it, set it aside for a time when setting key things aside would not be necessary. By the third night the fever broke. Will returned to himself in stages, the breathing first, then the eyes, then the expression of a man tracking his location and the sequence of events that had produced it. His first coherent words, the notebook, she confirmed it was still in his vest, which Agnes had folded over the chair beside the bed. He closed his eyes again, and the quality of his breathing changed from the work of illness to the work of genuine sleep, which was a different sound entirely and considerably more reassuring. On the 6th morning, a telegram arrived at Redstone's telegraph office for a Miss Helen Crane. The name Agnes had established as their contact address before they'd left Stone Creek, in language structured as a routine commercial inquiry about dry goods availability. Agnes's code was not elaborate. It did not need to be. 3 words embedded in the body of an otherwise unremarkable message. He is here. Colonel Silas Brandt had arrived in Stone Creek. Eliza read the telegram standing at the telegraph clerk's counter, read it twice, then burned it in the ashtray the clerk kept for the cigars he smoked between messages. He watched this without comment, because she had paid him in advance, and the payment had covered the transaction and whatever followed from it as part of the same arrangement. She walked back through Redstone's Main Street with the August sun doing its work overhead, and the telegram ash already cooling in the ashtray behind her. Brandt, the name from Thomas's journal, the name in Marshall's ledger with a $300 notation beside her father's name. The man who had looked at Thomas in front of Grayson's assayer office and had, according to Thomas's own written account, looked at him like something already decided. He was in Stone Creek now, which meant he had come to close something, which meant the window for using what they had before he sealed, it was narrowing in real time. Will was standing outside Reed's building when she got back, which was more than his right shoulder was prepared for 6 days after surgery, and which he had done anyway. He had dressed himself and stood in the morning sun with the arm in its sling, and the rest of him composed and present, and he had read her face coming down the street before she reached him. The telegram, Brandt is in Stone Creek. He absorbed this in the way he absorbed most information, quickly, without performance. The recalibration of a man who processes things and moves rather than processes things and announces the processing. We can't ride back into town directly. Marshall will have the main approaches covered. He knows we got out of that barn with something. He doesn't know exactly what, but he knows it wasn't nothing. There's another way in. She had been thinking about this since the first night in Redstone, lying awake while Will ran his fever and the town settled into its small hours. My father's cabin in the canyon. Buck knows it. It existed before Stone Creek had the roads it has now, and my father built it to be invisible from all of them. We watch from there, understand what Brandt is doing, plan accordingly. Penn, Will said. He said the name carefully. The way you handle something you know is fragile. If Brandt came from Denver to finish this, Penn is the one person still alive who can testify to what happened to your father. Brandt will have been there already, or done something worse than visited him. The second telegram arrived not as a telegram but as a boy of 15, named Mickey Finn, who worked the stables in Redstone, and had been given 50 cents by Agnes Voss and a description of Eliza and instructions to ride east if certain developments occurred. He found her outside Reed's building and stood before her with his hat in both hands and the expression of a young person carrying information he understood to be bad and had been composing himself to deliver since he'd gotten on his horse. Mrs. Ward. The lady at the saloon in Stone Creek, she said to come find you. He swallowed. Dr. Penn is dead. The street of Redstone continued its mourning around them, a wagon passing, a dog asleep under the hardware store awning, the ordinary persistence of a world that did not adjust its pace for specific losses. When, she said, they found him 4 days ago. His office, Mickey's voice dropped on what came next, arsenic. Sheriff Boone said it was suicide and closed it the same afternoon, 4 days ago. Which meant Penn had been dead since shortly after Brant's arrival in Stone Creek. Enough time for Brant to have assessed his situation, identified Penn as his most immediate liability, and acted on that assessment with the efficiency of a man who had been making these kinds of calculations for decades. The timeline was exact in the way that deliberate things are exact, arsenic. The same mechanism Penn had used on her father 12 years ago, deployed now on Penn himself. Whether that was Brant's idea of symmetry or simply the instrument he preferred, the result was the same. The one living person who could testify to what had been done to Hank Stone was gone, and the case for it had been ruled closed before the day was out by a sheriff who understood which side of his professional obligations kept him employed. She gave Mickey $1 because 50 cents was what Agnes had offered, and $1 was what the information was worth, and she wanted him to understand the distinction mattered. She told him to ride home and thanked him, and he went, Will, beside her. Penn's records. Brant won't have thought about records yet. Her mind was moving in the way it moved when she had something concrete to work with. He killed Penn to eliminate testimony. He'll believe that's sufficient. But Penn was a careful man, careful enough to administer poison over 2 weeks in calibrated doses and produce symptoms consistent with something else entirely. Careful men write things down. They write down what they did because the act of recording it is how they negotiate privately with themselves about the kind of people they've become. His office will be cleared soon. Not if we get there tonight, she looked at Will. At the sling on his right arm and the 6 days of healing underneath it. We leave this afternoon. That gives us a day and a half to reach the cabin before dark tomorrow. We rest one night, then we move. The cabin first, he confirmed. Not a question. The logic of it was plain. They needed the rest, needed to brief Buck and Agnes properly, needed to approach Penn's office from a position rather than directly off an exhausted horse. Then Penn's office, then Judge Holt. The sun was an hour past its peak. Redstone went about its afternoon. Will looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone doing a final check on a decision they've already made. There's something I need to say before we go back in there. He paused. The pause of a man who has decided to be honest about something difficult rather than let it remain unspoken for the convenience of both of them. Whatever we find in that office, whatever it tells you about your father and about Thomas, you don't carry it alone. That's not me trying to take anything that's yours. It's just true, and I think you should know it before we go. She looked at him standing in the Redstone afternoon with his arm in a sling and his brother's jaw, and his own quality of saying the thing that cost him something to say. I know, she told him. Which was true, which was also, she understood, the beginning of something she was not in a position to name yet but was aware of. The way you are aware of weather changing in a sky that hasn't yet produced clouds. They went inside to prepare for the ride back. They rode back into Stone Creek the long way, adding 4 miles to avoid every road that Marshall's people would have reason to watch. No moon yet when they left Redstone that afternoon. By the time the outskirts of Stone Creek appeared below them as scattered lamplight in the dark. Arriving a day and a half after their departure from Redstone, having stopped for a few hours' rest in the hills when the horses needed it and they needed it more, the moon had risen enough to be a problem and not enough to be useful, which was the kind of compromise that made everything harder without making anything impossible. Buck knew the approach to the canyon cabin without needing to think about it. The knowledge of 30 years lived in this territory, knowledge that existed in the body rather than the mind. He led them north of town along a dry creek bed that didn't appear on any surveyor's map the county had commissioned. The horses picking their way through the gravel with the patient accuracy of animals that knew the ground was making demands and had decided to meet them. Will rode without complaint. The right shoulder had been redressed by Reed before they left Redstone, wrapped tightly enough to function if not comfortably, which was the version of medical care available to people who had places to be before their injuries were fully prepared for travel. He used his left arm for everything the right arm had previously shared the work of, and he had been practicing this adaptation for 6 days, and it showed in the economy of his movements. Nothing wasted, nothing attempted that couldn't be completed. Hank Stone's cabin was exactly where Buck's memory said it was, and exactly as invisible from the surrounding terrain as it had been built to be. The walls were the color of the canyon rock behind them. The single window faced the only approach. The door sat in shadow that the moonlight wouldn't reach until well past midnight. Her father had understood that the most important thing about a retreat was that it could not be found by someone who was looking for you, only by someone you had already chosen to bring. On the beam above the door, carved with a jackknife in the years before she was born, a piece of flint straying sparks, his mark, his shorthand for what he was and what he was capable of producing when the situation required it. She had not been here since his funeral. 12 years of telling herself there was no reason to come back, and now she was standing in the doorway at midnight, understanding that the real reason had been simpler and less flattering. She had been afraid that the cabin would be full of him in the way. Places are full of people who spent significant time in them, and that walking through the door would make her 5 years old again, and powerless and certain of his invincibility, and then immediately require her to remember how that story ended. She walked through the door anyway, because she was 33 years old and her father was gone, and the cabin was just a cabin, a room built from stone and intention. And grief was not a reason to avoid a useful shelter. May was asleep on the cot within minutes of arriving, the wooden doll tucked against her collarbone in the position it always occupied when May slept, her breathing the deep, even rhythm of a child who trusts completely. Agnes had brought her from the Golden Spur at dusk 2 days prior, the two of them arriving at the canyon head on a single horse while the light was still ambiguous. May with her doll, and the uncanny composure of a child who had decided her mother's arrangements were correct by definition. Buck allowed a very small fire in the stone hearth, small enough to be invisible from the canyon mouth, large enough to be genuinely useful. He stood at the window with his shotgun and did not sit down. His left knee, where a rock fragment kicked up by a ricochet had opened a cut during the escape from Marshall's ranch 6 nights ago, had been wrapped by Reed in redstone and re-wrapped tonight with fresh cloth from Agnes's saddlebag. It did not appear to be slowing him down in any measurable way, which was either a testament to his constitution or to his unwillingness to let it slow him down, and Eliza had stopped trying to determine which they slept. All of them, even Buck, who allowed himself 4 hours in the chair with his shotgun across his knees and called it sufficient. The canyon dark was complete and quiet and gave them what they needed. The plan for Penn's office had 3 working parts. Get in before Brandt's people cleared it. Find whatever Penn had written down. Get it to Judge Calvin Holt. The federal circuit judge who rode this territory and who Buck had confirmed was currently in Stone Creek. 2 weeks into what was scheduled to be a month-long review of territorial land disputes. The exact review that had apparently prompted Brandt's arrival, and that Brandt had apparently decided could not be permitted to conclude. Sybil. The way plans are simple before they encounter the resistance of actual conditions. She and Buck left the following night, 24 hours after arriving at the cabin, rested and fed and with a clear understanding of what they were going in for. Will stayed with May and Agnes, which he did not argue about, which told her the right shoulder was managing less than the redressing suggested. Before they left, Buck pulled Will aside for 30 seconds and said something she didn't hear. Will nodded once. She noted this and filed it without asking about it, because Buck Harlan did not spend 30 seconds on anything that didn't require 30 seconds. Penn's office occupied the 2nd floor above the apothecary on Stone Creek's Main Street, accessed by an exterior staircase running up the east side of the building. The staircase was old enough that each tread had developed individual opinions about bearing weight. Eliza learned those opinions on the ascent, stepping on the outer edges where the wood met the risers most solidly. The same structural reading she had applied to Marshall's office floor. The official seal on the door was wax, and a county stamp placed by Sheriff Boone sometime in the previous several days, indicating that this was a matter of official record pending inquiry. The inquiry being, presumably, the one Boone had concluded in under 3 hours and declared a suicide, which meant the seal was less a protection of evidence and more a performance of having followed procedure before closing the file. The window to the left of the door was the building's original glazing, settled in its frame over 4 decades in a way that had loosened its fit to the point of being a different kind of entry entirely. Buck had it open in under a minute. Working with the knowledge of a man who had spent 30 years as deputy learning more than was strictly official about the ways that buildings in this county could be persuaded. The smell of the room was what she'd expected and was still wrong to encounter. The medical baseline underneath everything, carbolic and the residue of tinctures, and beneath that, something with no clinical name. The air of a room where something that could not be undone had recently occurred. She did not look at the stain on the carpet near the desk. The filing cabinets stood against the east wall. She went through them with the methodical speed of someone who has organized her own professional records for 13 years and understands how professionals order what they're most anxious about. First cabinet, patient records, alphabetical, worn at the edges with the use of a busy practice. Second, correspondence, bills, medication orders, standard accounts. Third, older materials, records from the previous decade. Fourth cabinet. In the back, behind folders dated from the early 1870s. A journal, small, black cover. No label on the spine. She carried it to the table, Buck at the window. The lamp turned as low as it would produce useful light. Penn had been keeping this book since 1865, not a medical journal. Something that occupied the uncomfortable territory between private confession and personal record. The accounting of a man who had done things that required accounting and had chosen paper over silence as his particular method of managing what he had become. Payments received for services outside the ordinary scope of medicine. Adjustments made to official documents at the request of parties with interests in those adjustments. A pattern of men with money and requirements finding their way to a physician who had learned to meet requirements without excessive moral consultation, if the payment was correct and the risks were manageable. And then, dated November 1872, payment received $300. Client, Colonel S. Brandt, Denver. Service, arsenic procurement and administration over a 2-week period. Dosage calibrated to produce symptoms consistent with acute pneumonia. Subject, Henry Stone. Rancher, Stone Creek. Delivery completed in 4 administrations beginning November 9th. Death confirmed November 20th. Certificate signed. Cause listed as pneumonia, natural onset. No autopsy recommended. Client confirmed, satisfied. Below this, written in different ink and added years later, October 1879. Client returned through intermediary, one of Marshall's men. Same type of request, different subject. Thomas Ward. Rancher, 31 years old. I refused. The first time, I constructed reasons. Ward is young. I will not do this again. The intermediary conveyed that my refusal was noted. I have understood what that notation meant since October 1879, and have found no way to stop understanding it. And most recently, the cramped, effortful handwriting of a man whose hand was no longer steady. August 1880. Colonel Brandt arrived in Stone Creek several days ago. He came to see me in person shortly after his arrival. He did not make threats in language. He conveyed with complete clarity that his satisfaction with my continued silence was contingent upon that silence continuing, and that his satisfaction was, like all satisfactions, temporary in nature. He also made clear that he is aware I kept records. I do not know how he knows this. If this journal is found after my death by someone who is not Colonel Brandt or his people, I ask that they understand I have carried what I did to Hank Stone for 12 years, and the carrying has had a cost that I am not asking anyone to credit against what I owe. It is simply true. Colonel Brandt murdered me as surely as I murdered Stone. The mechanism differs. The result will be the same. May God have mercy, since I cannot. The lamp was very low. The street outside was very quiet. She read the last entry a second time. Not for information, she had the information. For the 12 years that Penn had carried this, while she had believed her father died of something impersonal and beyond anyone's arrangement. for the distance between those two realities and the specific cost of crossing it. Buck's voice from the window, barely audible. "We need to move." She closed the journal, placed it inside her coat against her ribs. Buck had already moved to the window. Outside, something had shifted in the texture of the night. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of a sound that had been present before. The way a room changes when someone enters it before you see them, the air reorganizing around a new presence, the staircase, outer edges of the treads. She was through the window and on the stairs before her thoughts had caught up with her feet, and Buck was behind her, and they were most of the way down when the first man came around the corner from the main street. Not one man. 4, positioned across the alley mouth and the street entrance and the far end with the geometric precision of people who had been placed there rather than arriving independently. Professional arrangement. Patient execution. They had been in position while she was inside, waiting for her to finish and come out, rather than preventing her from entering, because what they wanted was her, not the prevention of her finding whatever she found. She understood this in the second it took her to assess the angles. Brand had known about the journal, had known she would come for it, had let her come. Buck's shotgun answered the first shot from the east end of the alley, one barrel, placed at the muzzle flash. She was already running north, into the residential grid behind the commercial block, the network of back lanes and kitchen gardens and fence lines she had walked through 100 ordinary times and now moved through at a pace those ordinary times had not required. Behind her, Buck's shotgun again. Then return fire from 2 different guns, the sound profiles distinguishable. 2 men working from different positions, coordinating on training rather than visibility. The church was ahead and to the left. White clapboard, dark windows. Unlocked in the custom of frontier churches that hadn't yet accumulated enough reason to change that particular policy. She went for it. The door opened from the inside before she reached the steps. 2 men positioned inside, waiting. The church had been covered. Both routes from the apothecary had been covered, which meant Brandt had anticipated both exits and had allocated people to both before she had entered the building, which meant this was not a response to her movements tonight, but a plan that had been in place before she arrived. She spun back toward the alley, where Buck was still working, still buying time with what he had available. Between her and the alley, 30 yards of open ground, Buck was 40 feet behind her, still functional, still firing, but the alley was tightening behind him, the sound of it clear even at this distance. The 2 churchmen were out the door now, moving up on her left. The geometry of it had closed. The space between her and Buck was the space between getting out of this and not getting out of it, and it was 30 feet. And it was full of men who had been put there by someone who had thought about this more carefully than she had. His voice aimed at her with the precision of a man who understood that volume was a resource he couldn't spend here. Frontier House Hotel. Judge Holt. Room 12. Go. She started toward him. The shotgun came up, aimed at her, and his voice hit the air with a quality she had never heard from him before. Your father did not die so you could throw away what he built in you standing in this alley for a stubborn old man. That journal is worth more than both of us tonight. Move, she ran, not looking back. She had decided in the first stride that looking back was something she was not going to do, because looking back would show her either something she couldn't help or something she could and couldn't afford to stop for. And the outcome on her feet was the same regardless of what her eyes reported. Buck Harlan's shotgun continued behind her. He was drawing their attention and holding it by the sheer stubborn fact of still being there and still responding, and she understood what that was costing and ran faster because of it. 3 blocks to the Frontier House Hotel. She covered them through back alleys and over 2 fence lines, and through a yard where a dog barked once and then seemed to reconsider. Moving in the way her father had moved through difficult country, purposeful and low, and using everything available as cover, without stopping to plan each individual use of it. The hotel's kitchen entrance was at the rear, unguarded because the people guarding the hotel were guarding the front entrance where guests arrived, not the back where kitchen deliveries were made. She went through the kitchen, 1 lamp, smell of the evening supper, nobody present, and up the servants' stairs that ran along the building's back wall, the stairs that existed for the people who maintained the hotel rather than the people who stayed in it, The stairs that were never watched because the people who watched stairways watched the formal ones. Revan 12. Second floor. She knocked once, paused, knocked twice more. The pattern Buck had established before they'd left the cabin the previous night, the pattern that would tell whoever was inside that this arrival was expected rather than a problem. The door opened. Royce Marshall stood in the doorway. Behind Marshall, two men, and in the chair beside the window, wrists bound behind him with professional efficiency and a strip of cloth serving as a gag, Judge Calvin Holt, 60 years old, white-haired and lean, a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled and dried. His eyes above the gag were level and present and not afraid in any way she could detect, which she noted with the specific recognition of someone who has recently become acquainted with what that looks like from the inside. In Marshall's right hand, a journal. Black cover, she looked at it. Looked at it again. Black cover, small format, no label on the spine, identical to the journal inside her coat. Dosh flipped through it with the casual interest of a man confirming a thing exists. Careful little man pen. Kept records of everything. He walked to the small fireplace in the corner of the room where a fire burned in August because someone had started it for this specific purpose. I've read it. The relevant parties have been informed of its contents. The journal went into the fire. The pages caught immediately. 15 years of Penn's private accounting, the dates and amounts and names, the refusal regarding Thomas, the final entry about Brandt's arrival and what it meant for Penn's immediate future. Gone, no ledger, no journal. No living witness, no physical document connecting Colonel Silas Brandt to the death of Hank Stone or the murder of Thomas Ward or the killing of Elias Penn. Nothing that could be held in a hand or read aloud in a courtroom or signed by a judge. Come in, Mrs. Ward. Marshall's voice had the smoothness back, the smoothness she had watched him retrieve with effort at the Golden Spur. Now fully restored because he had the room arranged the way he preferred it. We've been expecting this version of tonight since you climbed out of my barn. Her hands went up. Slowly, she stepped into the room. The two men moved behind her. One of them checked the door. She noted their positions without appearing to. The window. Judge Holt was closest to it. The fireplace. Penn's journal was ash now, Marshall. Between her and the judge, standing easy in the way of a man who has the variables where he wants them, her right boot, the Derringer, which they had not found because the man who had taken the Colt at her hip in Marshall's office had been thinking about the Colt and had considered the accounting complete, and because people see what they have been told to look for and rarely look further. 2 shots. She was aware of having 2 shots in a room with 3 men and a tied judge, and she was doing the arithmetic that this required. The journal. Marshall set his hands in front of him with the patience of a man who has already won and is simply concluding the formality. I know you have whatever Penn kept. Brandt told me he kept something. So let's simplify the rest of the evening. Hand it over. She said nothing. Dalshall turned to Judge Holt, picked up his revolver from the table beside the fireplace, placed the barrel against the judge's temple with the deliberateness of a man performing an action he has already decided to perform and is now simply executing. I'm going to count to 3. If I reach 3, this wall gets a new coat of paint and the circuit loses an honest judge, which I will personally consider a mixed outcome. He looked at her. 1, her right hand moved to her coat. 2, she reached inside, felt the journal against her ribs. Her fingers closed around it and she pulled it out and held it up, not Penn's journal, one of the books from her father's cabin shelf. Old, battered, water-damaged at the edges from years sitting in a stone room through New Mexico winters. The same small format, the same dark cover worn smooth with time, indistinguishable in a dim room from what Marshall expected to see. Buck had switched them at the canyon head before they'd left for town. She had been checking the horse's cinches and he had been standing behind her, and he had made the exchange without announcing it. Because Buck Harlan had spent 30 years working in conditions where the most important thing you carried into a situation was not what you planned to use but what you needed the other side to believe you were using, and because he had told Will something during those 30 seconds before they left the cabin, and what he had told Will she now understood. If they take her, they'll burn whatever she's carrying. Make sure they burn the wrong thing. Marshall took the book from her, flipped through blank pages. His expression did not change immediately. The smoothness held for 2 full seconds, which was long enough for her to understand that he was a more controlled man than most. that the smoothness was structural rather than performed, that it took something genuinely large to move it. What moved it was the understanding of what blank pages meant. She reached into her boot, the Derringer came out. First shot. Marshall, chest. Not a large caliber, but entirely sufficient at this range, and the range was 6 feet. He went back against the wall and did not come forward again. Second shot, the man closest to Judge Holt, whose hand was already moving toward his own weapon. The shot took him in the shoulder and changed his immediate priorities from Judge Holt to his shoulder, which gave her the 3 seconds she needed to cross the room and put herself between him and the chair. The third man came from her left. She was out of shots. The Derringer was a 2-shot weapon, and she had fired both shots, and she had known this before she fired the first one. She had bet that the third man was not the kind of professional who improvised fluently when the situation diverged from his instructions, that the combination of Marshall down and his colleague suddenly focused on a shoulder wound would produce. In the third man, a hesitation. She was right. He stopped, looked at Marshall on the floor, at the other man recalibrating his priorities, at Judge Holt still tied in the chair and suddenly in a different geometric relationship to everyone in the room. Looked at Eliza standing between the judge and the remaining armed man with an empty 2-shot pistol and an expression that accurately communicated she was not finished regardless of the ammunition count. The door opened. Will Ward came through it with his working arm and Marshall's own revolver, which he later learned he had taken from the guard posted at the exterior of room 12. The guard Buck had told him to expect, and had told him where to find before they'd left the cabin, the 30-second conversation she hadn't heard. Will's face was the color of a man who has ridden 2 days with a bullet wound, and then climbed stairs on insufficient sleep, and is running on the part of the human system that does not consult the body about what is reasonable before making demands of it. The third man looked at this new development, made a professional assessment of his current situation, set his gun on the floor. Eliza crossed to Judge Holt, cut his bonds with the knife from her boot, the knife she had been carrying since the first night at the Golden Spur when Agnes had pressed it into her hand and said simply, "Keep it somewhere useful." She pulled the gag free. Holt coughed once, a single clearing of the throat, the sound of a man preparing to address a courtroom. Then he looked at her with 60 years of assessed situations behind his eyes, and the patience of someone who has presided over enough chaos to stop being surprised by its particular shapes. "Mrs. Ward," his voice was rough from the cloth and entirely itself. "I've been investigating Brandt's land operations in this territory for 6 months. That's why they took me. I want you to know that before you tell me anything, so you understand that what you give me goes into an existing case rather than starting one from scratch." She told him everything, from Thomas's journal to the survey markers and the silver to Marshall's ledger to Penn's private record. Every date she remembered, every amount, every name, the sequence at which things had happened and the sequence in which she had learned they had happened, because Holt wanted both and was writing both down in a notebook of his own, a larger one than Will's, a judge's notebook with the structure of a man building a legal case rather than recording events. Will read the copied entries from his vest pocket notebook when she reached that point in the account, his handwriting slightly compressed from the shoulder but legible, every number and date intact. Holt wrote, asked 3 clarifying questions, each brief and precise, the questions of someone who understood what kind of evidence was usable and wanted only what was. When she finished, Holt signed the notebook, had her sign beneath his name, had Will sign beneath hers. Sworn testimony given under material duress with an injured conspirator present and a sitting federal circuit judge as witnessing officer. It's not a clean evidentiary package. He looked at her over the notebook. I've prosecuted successful cases with considerably less, and I have 6 months of my own investigation to bring alongside it. He went to the window and called down to the street below. Buck Harlan's voice answered from somewhere in the darkness outside, alive, present, and apparently unimpressed by the events of the previous 40 minutes. Eliza heard this and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since the alley. 2 federal marshals arrived at the Frontier House inside of 20 minutes, men who had ridden up from the county seat 2 days earlier at Holt's request, positioned in town and waiting for the signal that Holt had just given them from the window. Brandt had not known about them. Marshall had not known about them. The judge had been taken before he could use them, but the taking had not moved them from their positions because their instructions had been to wait for his signal. And that was what they had done. They took Marshall on a stretcher, alive, the chest wound serious but survivable, and the two remaining men in custody, and Holt sent one of them to find and detain Sheriff Dale Boone, pending a separate inquiry into the conduct of his office over the previous 8 months, which was going to be a longer conversation than tonight could contain. Eliza sat down in the chair where Holt had been tied and did not immediately stand back up. Will stood beside her, not touching her, not speaking. Just there, which was what the moment required, and which he apparently understood without being told. After a minute she stood up. In the 8 days between the night at the Frontier House and the public hearing, 3 things happened. Colonel Silas Brandt was taken into custody at the Barton House Hotel at 4 in the morning by the 2 federal marshals, who found him dressed and awake, which meant some part of his network had been feeding him information about the night's events, and which meant he had spent the hours since midnight calculating his options, and had concluded that the options were narrowing faster than he could exercise them. He came out of his room without resistance, which was not a function of having given up, but of having assessed the specific situation and determined that resistance at this juncture cost him more than it produced. He was a man who thought in longer terms than most, and the longer terms still required him to be alive and functional to pursue. Scholl survived his chest wound, which Dr. Reed, summoned from Redstone by Holt's riders, confirmed within 24 hours. He would face the territorial court from a hospital bed and then from a cell, and Holt had a list of charges prepared for both contingencies and Will Ward. 6 days after surgery, on a morning when the fever had been gone long enough to believe it was gone rather than resting, walked to the telegraph office in Stone Creek and sent a wire to the Land Survey office in Santa Fe inquiring about available positions. He told Eliza about this that evening in the matter-of-fact way he told her most things, directly, without performance, as information she was entitled to have rather than a declaration requiring a response. She received it in the same register. They were getting better at that. Stone Creek's town square had never held this many people at once in Eliza's memory, and she had lived in this county for 33 years and had attended every public occasion it had produced. They filled the street in both directions from the square. They stood on the rooftops of the buildings facing east. They occupied every window along the main frontage with the committed patience of people who had decided they were not leaving until this concluded. Judge Calvin Holt sat behind a table, moved from the Golden Spur, and positioned on the saloon's covered porch at a height sufficient to be seen and heard from the square. He had combed his hair and changed his coat. The cut above his left eyebrow had closed. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who presided over things and was in the act of presiding. Brandt sat in chains 12 feet in front of him, flanked by both federal marshals. His lawyer had arrived from Denver on the first morning stage, a man in a coat that said he was accustomed to better air than this, who had shaken his client's hand and spent the intervening days reviewing the available materials and arriving at a professional assessment that had done nothing to improve his client's demeanor. Eliza stood at the front. She had changed into the cleanest dress she'd brought, which was a dark blue that made her look, she suspected, precisely like what she was. A woman who had been in a situation for several weeks that did not permit attention to appearance. She had done her hair and it had stayed where she put it. She was standing in a public square in front of everyone who had known her since childhood, everyone who had known her father, everyone who had brought their worn seams and their daughter's occasion dresses to her shop on ordinary afternoons, and she was going to tell them a story about what had been happening in their town while they had been living their ordinary lives. She told it without performance. The sequence of it, the dates and the names and the amounts, the survey markers and the silver beneath Thomas's land, the journal he had kept and the night she found it, the ledger in Marshall's safe and the entries Will had copied by the light of a narrow window, Penn's private record and what it contained about her father's death. The lawyer from Denver made objections at intervals. Holt noted them in a tone that communicated he was noting them in the same way he would note the weather, as a fact of the environment that did not alter the proceedings. Will read the copied entries from his notebook when she reached that point in the account, his voice steady and clear, his left hand holding the notebook open since his right arm remained in its sling. The handwriting she had watched him produce by moonlight in Marshall's office now converted back into words that the square could hear. The lawyer. Your Honor, these are copies made by a man with a financial interest in the outcome, of documents that no longer exist in their original form. They could say anything, Holt. They say exactly what Mr. Ward just read aloud, Counselor. Proceed with your objection or yield the floor, then Buck. From the front row, the telegraph office. Your Honor, every message transmitted from Stone Creek's office is recorded and retained. The records go back 11 years, Chester Gale. The telegraph operator had been in the second row the entire morning with a folder of yellow paper in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been waiting for his moment and has been patient about the waiting. He came forward when Holt called him. He was 60 years old and had kept this office for 11 of them and maintained his records with the professional pride of someone whose job was accuracy and who had never been asked to produce that accuracy in this particular context before, but found himself entirely prepared to do so. Holt read the 3 telegrams aloud into the August morning, the 1st, November 1872. Denver originating, Stone Creek destination, Penn, Stone Matter, proceed as planned. Payment follows confirmation, Brant. The square went quiet in the way squares do not usually go quiet. The 2nd, December 1879. Denver originating, Stone Creek destination. Marshall, Ward disposed. Consolidation may proceed per prior arrangement, Brant. One of the women in the crowd made a sound that was not a word. Nobody in the square spoke the 3rd, 3 weeks ago. Denver originating, Stone Creek destination, Marshall. Holt arrives circuit next week. He cannot complete his inquiry. Handle before 2nd week. Brant Haddle. The square held the word for a moment in the August heat. 300 people in the silence that arrives when something that has been suspected or half-known becomes confirmed and public and impossible to unknow. Eliza looked at Brant as Holt set the 3rd telegram down. He was looking at the table in front of him rather than at the crowd. Not at his lawyer, not at Holt, not at the telegrams in the judge's hand. At the table. The specific quality of that stillness was different from the controlled stillness he had maintained throughout the morning. Not the stillness of a man managing his presentation, but the stillness of a man absorbing a final accounting. The arithmetic of a life's decisions arriving at their sum in public, in front of 300 people, read aloud in someone else's voice. His jaw was set, and his hands were flat on the table, and whatever was happening behind his face was happening in the room he had the most privacy in, which was the room entirely inside himself. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he lifted his eyes to Holt's and held them, and the expression that had replaced the absorbed stillness was the expression of a man who has decided that dignity, at this point, is the only remaining asset worth managing. The square broke open. Voices, movement, the complicated noise of a community in the process of revising its understanding of the past 2 years and the past 12, and what had been happening in this town while it had been living its ordinary life. Holt's gavel. I find sufficient evidence to bind the defendant over for trial before the federal district court on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, murder for hire, corruption of a public official, and attempted murder of a federal circuit judge. He looked at Brant for a moment with the expression of a man who has seen a considerable number of things over a long career and has not become indifferent to any of them. I take particular personal interest in that last charge, for reasons the court will appreciate. Bond is denied. The defendant is remanded to federal custody effective immediately. Gavel down. The square broke into noise that was primarily a single sustained sound, the sound of a verdict landing in the right place after a long time in the wrong one. As the marshals moved Brant toward the street, he turned and found Eliza in the crowd with the directness of a man who has identified the correct target and has not stopped identifying it regardless of what has changed around the identification. I have resources that outlast this proceeding, he said. Not loud, for her specifically, meant to be heard by her and no one else. Appeals reviews. People in positions that this judge cannot touch. I have walked away from worse than this. She looked at him, considered what to say. Considered the 12 years her father had been dead while she believed it was weather and bad luck. Considered Thomas found at the bottom of the canyon with his eyes open to the winter sky. Considered May in Agnes's back room, counting bottles on the bottom shelf while men burned her mother's shop. She didn't say anything, because the thing she wanted to say was the kind of thing that, spoken aloud in a public square, would reduce something she intended to keep to something performed for an audience, and she did not want to perform it. She wanted to hold it. For herself. The knowledge that she had stood in the path of this man and had not been moved from it, had in fact moved him from it, had done it with her father's hands and her own judgment, and the specific kind of stubbornness that looks like something else from the outside, Buck Harlan. 3 people to her left caught her eye. His face did something small and deliberate that was not quite a smile but occupied the territory just next to one. She let them take Brant away. The break came on the 3rd night after the hearing, at the hour when the town was most deeply asleep, and the marshals holding Brant had been on their shift long enough to have made peace with the uneventful nature of the duty. Eliza was awake when she heard Buck's footsteps on the path to the cabin. She had been awake for an hour, the old awareness functioning as it always did when something was approaching, the inheritance from her father that operated below the level of conscious thought. She had the Colt in her hand before Buck knocked. He opened the door and said 4 words. Brant's gone. Both marshals not sleeping. Both men dead. Brant in the wind with at least an hour's lead and the resources to have arranged transport and an exit route in advance. Because a man like Brant did not place himself in a position without having already arranged the position after that one. Will was dressed and armed before Buck finished speaking, moving from the cot to the door, with the speed of someone who has been half expecting this and has been sleeping accordingly. May slept through it. Agnes looked up from the chair where she'd been sitting with the Winchester across her knees. She had not been asleep, and her expression said she had made her own assessment of the likelihood of this development and was unsurprised to find she had been correct. Eliza stood in the cabin doorway and looked at the canyon dark and understood, without requiring anyone to say it, where Brant was going. He was coming here. She was the loose end. She had the testimony, the signed statement, the living memory of the ledger entries and Penn's journal and the telegrams and every specific detail that would be required to rebuild the case from testimony alone if the physical record was ever successfully challenged. She was the case. And a man like Brant, who had spent 40 years understanding that the shortest distance between a problem and its resolution was direct action, was going to come to the most direct solution available, before dawn made options scarce. He knows about the cabin, Buck said. No, she was certain of this in the way you are certain of things that you know from logic rather than information. He knows I'm somewhere outside town. He'll check the obvious places first. Agnes's rooms, the hotel. He'll come here eventually, but not first. That gives us time. Enough. She looked at Will. He was already reading her face with the attention he'd developed over the past 2 weeks. The specific literacy that comes from spending significant time with someone in conditions that do not permit social performance. He knew what she was thinking before she said it. Not alone, he said. You can't shoot with that arm, I can ride. May needs. Agnes has May, he said it with the calm of someone who has already completed this argument in his head and is reporting the conclusion rather than beginning the negotiation. Agnes has had May since this started and she's not going to stop now. You know that. He picked up his rifle, left-handed, the accommodation of a man who has been practicing this for 6 days. You're not going alone, she looked at him for a moment. Then at Buck, I'll position at the canyon mouth. Anyone comes in, they come past me. You two take the high ground above the cabin. This was the plan, not elaborate, not elegant. The plan of people who have learned that elaborate plans produce elaborate failures, and that the simplest arrangement consistent with the objective is usually the right one. They moved before first light. The high ground above the cabin was a ledge of rock 40 feet above the canyon floor, accessible by a path that Eliza knew because her father had shown it to her when she was 8 years old on the premise of showing her a view, which it was, and also on the premise of showing her that the cabin below could be seen from this angle, and that anyone watching from here would have advanced knowledge of anything approaching from the north, which it could, and that there was a secondary path down the back of the ledge that emptied into the canyon floor 200 yards east of the cabin, which there was. Her father had thought about these things, had built the knowledge of them into her before she knew what she was being taught. She and Will were on the ledge before the sky began to lighten in the east. The canyon below was still fully dark. The cabin sat in its fold of rock, firelight visible through the window where Agnes had kept a small lamp burning, May asleep on the cot inside. They waited. The riders came from the north at 5:30, just as the sky began to separate from the horizon in the east, that ambiguous pre-dawn light that makes distances unreliable and shapes approximate, 6 of them. Brant on a grey horse at the front, sitting with the military straightness that had apparently persisted through the night, and the violence, and the changed circumstances, without departing from him, the posture of a man for whom bearing was a professional matter that did not respond to external events. He stopped at the canyon mouth. Buck Harlan's shotgun spoke once from the rocks to the left of the entrance, and one of the 6 horses went sideways without its rider, and the 5 remaining horsemen reorganized themselves in a way that said they understood the geometry had just changed. Brant's voice, carrying up the canyon with the projection of a man accustomed to giving orders at field volume. "Mrs. Ward, I know you're here. I've known about this cabin since Marshall told me about it 2 days ago. I came to conclude the business between us before the courts make it more complicated than it needs to be," which confirmed he had spoken to Marshall after the hearing, which confirmed Marshall's operation had more reach than the men currently in custody represented, which was information worth having, filed and set aside for the moment. From the ledge, Eliza's rifle spoke. The shot was not aimed at Brant. It went into the ground 6 feet in front of his horse, which communicated that she could see him clearly and had chosen not to hit him, which communicated something about the nature of this conversation that the ground-aimed shot said more efficiently than words. Brant's horse shifted. He held it still with the ease of a cavalryman. 1 rifle. "What are you going to do with that, Mrs. Ward?" "What I've been doing," she said, from a position he couldn't precisely locate. Exactly enough, he made a signal with his left hand. 2 of his riders began dismounting at the canyon mouth, moving to flank the rock walls on either side, looking for the angle that would give them the ledge. Buck's shotgun spoke twice more in quick succession, and one of the flanking men made a decision to revise his position, and the other had the decision made for him. 3 men left mounted at the canyon mouth, Brant among them. She sighted along the rifle barrel, 130 yards. Downhill angle. Her father's instruction working through her hands without requiring conscious thought. Account for the drop, let the breath out, hold at the still point. She put the shot between the feet of Brant's grey horse, precisely, the shot of someone who has chosen her target with care. Brant held his horse still. He was looking up at the ledge, still unable to locate her precisely, squinting into the angle of the pre-dawn light. "You're better than I expected," he said. "Not praise. Assessment, I'm my father's daughter. Your father is dead, you made sure of that." She worked the rifle's action, the brass cartridge case spinning out and catching the first grey light. "And here you are." Which tells you something about how well that worked. One of the remaining mounted men said something to Brant in a low voice. Brant listened. His expression, even at this distance she could read. The expression of a man receiving information about his situation that confirms a calculation he has already made. He looked up at the ledge one more time. Then he looked at the canyon mouth, where Buck Harlan's position in the rocks had just been confirmed by the muzzle flash of the shotgun, and at the path up the canyon that was a single file approach under fire, and at the ledge above the cabin, where a woman was shooting with enough precision to choose her targets rather than simply firing. He pulled his horse around. The 3 remaining men rode north out of the canyon mouth and into the pre-dawn dark of the territory beyond. She did not fire at them. Will, beside her, his left hand still on his rifle. "He'll run." She was watching the dust of the departing horses settle in the lightning air. "He'll circle. Come in from the south by midday. He's not done. Then we go to him." She looked at Will, at the specific quality in his face of a man who has thought this through, and is not suggesting something he hasn't already accepted the implications of. Go to him. He came here because he thinks this is where he has the advantage. His ground, his timing, his numbers. Will shifted the rifle in his left hand. "Take all of that away." She looked at the cabin below. May in there on the cot, the wooden doll against her chest, Agnes in the chair with her Winchester. Buck making his way up the canyon floor toward the ledge. The carved mark above the cabin door, just visible in the growing light, flint striking sparks. Her father had carved that. had built this place and carved that mark and shown a 12-year-old girl how to see the high ground and the secondary path and the angle from the ledge, had broken a gun so she would live in peace and left her a letter so she would know, when peace ran out, that she had his permission for whatever came next. "Where is he?" she said to Buck, who had reached the ledge and was catching his breath without appearing to be catching his breath. "Barton House Hotel, best I'd guess. Had a room there since he arrived. Man like that goes to ground somewhere he's paid for." Buck looked at her. "You're thinking about going after him. I'm thinking about ending this." A pause. "Then I'll come with you. Your leg has been worse, Buck, has been considerably worse," he said, with the flat certainty of a man closing a topic. "I'll come with you. Will stays with May and Agnes." Will started to object. Buck looked at him with 62 years of having this argument. "Someone has to be here in case I'm wrong about the hotel. And someone has to be here that May knows a beat. Your brother would have stayed." This landed the way Buck had known it would land, not as manipulation, but as the truest thing available to say. Will was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. It was the nod of a man accepting something difficult because the thing is true, which was, she was coming to understand, the particular way Will Ward made decisions. She came down from the ledge, went into the cabin, stood beside May's cot for a moment in the early light coming through the window, watching her daughter breathe with the steady confidence of someone who has never yet had reason to doubt that morning arrives reliably. The wooden doll was tucked against May's chest in the position it always occupied. The painted smile had mostly worn away to a pleasant blankness. Her father had made the doll's equivalent, a different object, a different form, for her in a different time. The hands that made things for children were the same hands that had broken a gun to keep a child safe, and the broken gun was now whole and at her hip, and she was going to walk out of this cabin and take it to where it needed to go and come back. She would come back. She bent and pressed her lips to May's hair, very briefly, the touch of someone who is leaving and is not making a production of leaving. Then she walked out the door under the carved mark and into the morning. Brant was in the dining room of the Barton house when they came through the front door, sitting at the corner table with a cup of coffee and the morning stillness of a man who has made his calculations for the day and is waiting for the day to catch up with them. The dining room was otherwise empty at this hour, the hotel staff not yet visible, the building holding the particular quiet of a place between one day's ending and another's beginning. He looked at them when they came in. His two remaining men were visible, one at the bar, one at the foot of the stairs, and they looked at Buck and at the shotgun in a way that communicated they had updated their assessment of the morning's possibilities. "Mrs. Ward," Brant set down his coffee. No performance of surprise. No adjustment of the morning demeanor, and Mr. Harlan. "I wondered which direction you'd come from," the front Buck said. "Didn't seem like a morning for the back stairs." Eliza stopped 6 feet from Brant's table. The Colt was at her hip. She had not drawn it. "She did not draw it now, Colonel Brant." Her voice came out the way she had decided it would come out. Flat, clean, stripped of everything except the content. "You're going to come with us to Judge Holt. You're going to do this now, before the town wakes up, because what happens in the next 5 minutes determines whether you go to that hearing as a man who chose to face what he did or as a man who had to be carried there." Brant looked at her for a long moment. The assessment of a man who has spent 60 years reading situations and reading the people in them, and acting on those readings with a consistency that had produced the career he'd had, and the end of the careers of a number of people who had stood in the way of it. He looked at Buck's shotgun, at the two men by the bar and the stairs who were doing their own updated arithmetic, at Eliza, who was standing 6 feet from him with her father's gun at her hip, and her father's steadiness in her face, and something else that was entirely her own. The look of a woman who has paid a price she did not ask to pay, and has decided that the payment entitles her to stand exactly where she is standing for exactly as long as it takes. "Your father," Brant said, and paused. "Not a strategy now, something actual. He was the only man who ever refused me to my face and made me believe he meant it entirely, without anger, without fear. Just refused." He looked at the coffee cup. "I have thought about that refusal more than I have thought about most things in my life. He was like that," she said. "About things that mattered, he was right to refuse me." A pause that was not strategic. "That's not a thing I've said before." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Brant looked up from the coffee cup. looked at her with 60 years of everything that had brought him to this particular corner table, in this particular hotel, at this particular hour. And what she saw in his face was not remorse exactly. Remorse would have been too clean, too legible, but something more complicated and more human than she had expected to find there. The face of a man who has spent a long time being the kind of man he became and has arrived, at the end of the route, at a clear view of the whole distance. "I'll come with you," he said. He stood, left the coffee on the table, said something brief to his 2 men that resulted in them setting their weapons on the bar without being asked again. They walked out of the Barton House Hotel in the early morning light, Brant between Eliza and Buck, the 2 men from the hotel following at a distance that communicated they had made their decision about whose instructions they were following now, and it wasn't Brant's anymore. Stone Creek was waking up around them. The first wagons on the main street. The smell of breakfast fires from the residential blocks. A dog trotting purposefully along the boardwalk in the direction of something it had decided was important. At the door of the courthouse, where Holt was already at his bench, Brant stopped, looked back at Eliza with the expression of a man completing an accounting. "Hank Stone was a better man than most," he said. "He deserved better than what I arranged for him." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "He did." Brant nodded once. Went inside. The trial ran 4 days in the federal district court. The telegrams were admitted. Penn's journal, the real one, which had been in Eliza's coat when Marshall burned the decoy, and which Holt had taken into evidence the night of the Frontier House, was admitted. The ledger entries Will had copied were admitted as corroborating documentation. Holt testified. 2 of Marshall's former employees, facing their own proceedings and doing the arithmetic of cooperation, provided statements that Al-Shashel survived his wound and faced his own separate proceedings, conducted from a hospital bed and then from a cell. Sheriff Boone resigned before his separate inquiry concluded, which Holt noted for the record and the record noted without sympathy. Eliza gave her testimony on the second day and sat in the gallery for the remainder of the trial. She listened to Brant's lawyer make the arguments that could be made and watched the jury apply the telegrams and the journal and the ledger entries to those arguments. She watched the jury come back, guilty on all counts. She did not attend the sentencing. She had given what she had to give to this proceeding, and she understood that her presence at its conclusion was not required and would not add to what had already been concluded. There was a difference between witnessing justice and needing to watch it complete itself, and she had learned over the past several weeks to understand where that line was for her specifically. She was in Santa Fe when Buck's telegram arrived. 2 words, hanged, October. She read it once, folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and went back to watching the men hang the sign above the new storefront, Scone Dressmaking and Altiations, her father's name. The name she had been born with and had carried as a middle name through the ward years, and was now carrying as her primary name, which felt accurate in a way that the other arrangements had not felt, which felt like something her father would have found appropriate, without making a fuss about it. May was in the shop behind her, investigating the back room, with the comprehensive attention she brought to any new space, reporting discoveries as she found them. A loose floorboard, a window that stuck in its frame, a shelf at exactly the right height for her purposes, the assessment delivered with the authority of a 5-year-old who considers herself the relevant expert on the question of shelf heights. Will Ward was also in the building, having arrived in Santa Fe 4 days after Eliza and May, on grounds he described as having secured work with a land survey office that he'd written to from Stone Creek 3 weeks earlier. He had said nothing about the timing of his arrival relative to hers. She had said nothing about it either. They had both understood that the timing was the thing they were communicating, and that saying so directly would have made it smaller than it was. He came out the front door of the shop with his arm finally out of the sling and the look of a man who has been deciding how to begin a sentence for several days, and has not resolved the decision. The back room, he started. "Stopped, I know," she said. "It's not quite large, I know." He looked at her on the Santa Fe street with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as specifically his, the attention of someone who is present rather than waiting for his own turn to speak. "I'm not Thomas," he said. The honest thing said the way he said honest things, directly, without protecting himself from it. "I know that. I'm not trying to be." "No," she agreed. "You're not." A pause. The Santa Fe afternoon moved around them with the indifference of afternoons. "I'd like to stay," he said. "If that's something you'd consider." She looked at him. At his brother's jaw and his own specific quality of saying the true thing when the easier thing was available. At the notebook still in his vest pocket that contained 11 minutes of handwritten evidence that he had copied by moonlight in a dangerous room because it was the right thing to do, and he had done it without announcing the fact. May appeared in the doorway behind him. "Mama, there's a cat in the alley." Will turned. "What kind, old? One eye, that's a good sign. Can we keep it?" He looked at Eliza. The question was larger than the cat, and all three of them understood this with varying degrees of explicitness. "Yes," Eliza said. "We can keep it." May went back inside. The sound of her introducing herself to the cat came through the open window. Patient and persuasive, the voice of a child who understood that some things required introduction before they became permanent. Will looked at Eliza, and something in his face settled, the long-held tension of the previous weeks, releasing in a way that changed his expression from the concentrated focus it had maintained through all of it to something quieter and more durable. The look of a person who is in the right place, and knows it without requiring it to be announced. She let herself have that as well. Quietly, without making it into anything that required words right now, because some things were better understood than said, and some introductions took their own time. The sign above the door read stone. She was her father's daughter. She had walked the path he had tried to keep her from walking, and had come through the far side of it, and was standing on a Santa Fe street in the August warmth with a man she was not ready to name precisely yet, and her daughter's voice coming through an open window, and a life that was going to have to become familiar before it was comfortable, and that was going to become comfortable. She understood in its own time. Some things required introduction. The snow was falling heavier now, the kind that accumulated, that would be serious by morning. The room had gone quieter as the evening had deepened. The hospital sounds retreating, the world outside the window becoming less specific, more general. Clara had stopped holding the newspaper. It sat on the floor beside her chair where it had slipped without her noticing. Her grandmother's hand was lighter in hers than it had been 2 hours ago. Not a dramatic change, the kind of change that happens gradually and then is simply there. The way evening arrives, not at a specific moment but as the accumulated result of many small transitions. "The paper said 118, Clara said. Her voice came out careful, the way you speak in rooms where someone is finishing. Her grandmother's eyes opened one more time. Gray-green, the color of sage after rain, sharp in the specific way that some people's eyes remain sharp even when everything else is winding down. That's what they counted. The voice was very thin. Every man who came after us, after Will, after Buck before he died. Word got around the territory about the gun. Flintstone's daughter. The gun nobody thought would fire, a breath. Some of them I shot, some of them I didn't have to. Some of them looked at what they'd come for and turned around. Another breath. The newspaper counted all of them. I never counted. Clara looked at the Colt on the bedside table. The glistening barrel, the broken hammer, the brass frame worn to the color of old pennies. "You broke it again," she said. After it was over, walked into Pike's shop in Stone Creek. He was still alive, old as the hills, but alive. Paid him $20, a thin sound that was not quite a laugh. Same price my father paid. Same instruction, clean break at the base. A pause for breath that took longer than the previous ones. He understood. He didn't say anything about it. He just did it. Why? Because it was done. Her grandmother's eyes found the window, the snow accumulating on the ledge outside. That gun saved my life. Cost me things I don't have names for. But the fighting was finished, and finished things should look finished. Another breath. Some things earn their rest. Clara looked at the photograph in the newspaper on the floor. The woman standing before the storefront with the gun at her hip, looking at something on the horizon that the photograph's frame couldn't contain. 33 years old and looking at something the camera couldn't see. "Were you afraid?" Clara asked. Through all of it, her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Every minute of it. The voice was very quiet now, working on what remained rather than what had been usual. But being afraid and going anyway, that's not the same as bravery. It's closer to stubbornness. It's closer to, this is my daughter, this is my father's name, this is my husband's life that someone decided to account for in a ledger, and I am not willing to let those things be the end of the accounting. Clara tightened her hand around the thin hand in hers. Your mother. A pause. She's coming tomorrow. I know, tell her. Each word its own small project now. She knows what I would say. She's always known. The faintest shape of something on that face. And Clara, yes, keep it. The gun, she meant. Clara understood. Remember what it cost and what it bought. They're not the same number. They never are. A breath. Don't fix it. I won't. Unless you have to. I won't have to. You don't know that. Not a correction. A transmission of something from one generation to the next. The specific knowledge of a woman who had learned the hard way that the world makes its own decisions about when things are necessary. Nobody knows that. That's why you keep it. A very long breath. But if you do, she stopped. The sentence hung. Clara waited. Shoot straight, her grandmother said. Live free. And then, quieter still, so quietly that Clara leaned forward to be certain she heard it. That's all he ever wanted for me. That's all I want for you. Eliza Jane Stoneward died that night with her granddaughter holding her hand and snow falling on Denver and making the city quiet in the way that snow makes everything quiet, covering the distances and the angles and the hard lines of things under something softer. They buried her 3 days later in the cemetery on the hill east of the city beside Will, who had asked to be buried beside her in writing 11 years before his death with the matter-of-fact practicality that had been his particular way of making the true things permanent. May came from Santa Fe with gray at her temples and her mother's eyes and her grandfather's way of standing. Straight but not rigid, as though she had decided the world was going to have to work for it. May's daughter came beside her. 2 generations come to stand at the end of a third. The service was small. They spoke about the dresses she had sewn, the care she had taken with the things she made, the quiet life she had built in Santa Fe over 4 decades, the students she had dressed for occasions, and the neighbors she had helped with alterations, and the way she had sat in the window of the shop on winter mornings with Offie and her current project, and the particular contentment of a person who has found the right version of the life she was going to live. They did not speak about Stone Creek. They did not need to. The people who were there already knew, and the people who didn't know would read the newspaper at some point and encounter the headline on page 4, and the photograph of a small woman in a dark dress standing before a storefront, looking at something the camera couldn't contain, and they would understand or they would not. And either way, the story would remain exactly what it was. Clara rode the train back to Santa Fe 2 days later with the Colt in her bag. She sat with it in her lap for the first hour of the journey, turning it over in her hands the way you handle something you are deciding how to carry. The hammer was broken, clean at the base, done deliberately by someone who understood what she was doing and why, who had walked into an old man's shop and paid $20 and asked for the thing that looked like damage and was actually the opposite. The gesture of a woman who had decided that the fighting was finished and that the record of it should show as clearly as she could make it show. Clara put the gun in her bag. She had a house in Santa Fe and a school where she taught arithmetic and students who called her Miss Sinclair with the casual confidence of children who had no idea what she came from. She had a life that was the life her great-grandmother had cleared the ground for, had crossed difficult country to make possible, had paid a price that didn't fully add up in any simple accounting to make real. She had a broken gun and a story, and the specific knowledge that some inheritances don't look like inheritances when you first receive them. The train moved south through the New Mexico landscape, the red rock and the distance and the particular shade of blue above that country, the blue that doesn't exist in the same way anywhere else, the blue her great-grandmother had looked at from a canyon ledge in the hour before dawn and had decided, in that looking, what she was going to do next. At Santa Fe, Clara took the Colt home. Found 2 iron pegs she had kept in a drawer, for no reason she had been able to articulate since she'd brought them from her grandmother's house a year ago, and now understood. Mounted them on the wall of the front room at eye level, hung the gun on them. The hammer was broken. Exactly as it should be. Exactly as her great-grandmother had left it, as her great-great-grandfather had left it before her, each of them making the same decision in their own time for their own reasons, each of them understanding that the decision was not defeat but completion, not the end of something, but the correct shape of an ending. Beside the gun she placed the photograph from the newspaper. The woman in the dark dress standing before the storefront, the gun at her hip. The look on her face directed at something beyond the frame that no camera could follow. Eliza Jane Stoneward, 33 years old. Looking at the horizon, some things outlast the people who carry them. Some people deserve to outlast the things they've done, and some guns, broken once to protect a daughter, fixed once to save her, broken again when the saving was finished, earn the right to hang on a wall in the sun and be exactly what they are. A finished fight, a kept promise, a story that started with a needle moving through ivory silk and ended here, in the quiet of a Santa Fe afternoon, with snow on the way from the north and a school teacher standing in her front room, looking at a photograph of someone she had never met and knew completely. The hammer was broken, the story was not.